Welcome back to another story on The Fiction World. This time, we're bringing you, what if Deku became alpha predator of Jurassic World and bred all dinosaur queens. Deku x Harem. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Island Wakes. The last thing Izuku remembered before the world broke apart was green light. Not the soft green of spring grass or the gentle glow of a traffic signal. This was the green of something ancient and furious being torn open from the inside, the green of one for all at its absolute limit, every vestige screaming in unison, every previous holder pouring themselves into one final detonation that was supposed to end a battle and instead ended everything Izuku had known about where he was and what physics was allowed to do. He remembered the sky above Muzutafu cracking like old porcelain. He remembered falling. He did not remember landing. What he woke up to was the smell of rain-soaked earth and something older than rain. The kind of green that had been growing since before humans had a word for it. Heavy, layered air that pressed against his lungs like warm hands, thick with moisture and the chemical perfume of 1,000 plants doing 1,000 things. He opened his eyes and saw a canopy, massive, interlocking, filtering the morning sun into cathedral shafts of gold that slanted down through the mist. He was face down in mud. He pushed himself up slowly, checking himself the way he'd learned to after years of quirk battles. Fingers. Wrists. Arms. He flexed one for all through his right hand just enough to feel it, there, still there, humming low and vast the way an ocean hums when you press your ear against the hull of a ship. A little raw around the edges, like burned skin that hadn't quite healed, but present. Whole. His costume was shredded from the shoulders down but still mostly intact. His boots had survived. Small mercies. He stood up, and the jungle stared back at him. Not metaphorically. Something in this place had eyes, even where there were no visible eyes. He could feel it, attention, the way you feel someone staring at the back of your neck in a crowded room. He turned slowly, scanning, letting one for all sharpen his perception without flaring it. The trees here were enormous, not just tall but ancient, their trunks wide as houses, their root systems erupting from the soil like the knuckles of buried giants. Ferns spread in every direction at knee height, and somewhere behind the wall of green, water was moving. He took one step forward and his boot came down on something that cracked. He looked down. A concrete walkway, smashed and reclaimed, ferns splitting it apart at every seam. He followed the line of it with his eyes and saw, maybe 30 meters ahead, the rusted corner of a metal structure, a sign post. The sign itself was gone but the post was still standing, tangled in vines, and at the base of it was a piece of molded plastic, faded and cracked, that still had 4 letters visible through the weather damage. Izuku crouched and picked it up, turned it in his hands. He'd heard of this place. Everyone had, it had been in the news years before his world's hero collapse, treated as a curiosity, a distant impossibility made real by science that had outrun its own ethics. A theme park. Dinosaurs. An island. He set the plastic down carefully, like it was something that deserved respect. Right, he said aloud. His voice sounded strange in the thickness of the air, too small for the space. Okay. He wasn't afraid. That was the thing he noticed most, the absence of fear. There was something else in its place, something he'd been feeling in the months leading up to the final battle, a kind of settling. Like a compass needle that had been spinning for 20 years finally finding north. He straightened up, rolled his shoulders, and started walking. He heard them before he saw them. It was sound that didn't belong to any bird, a series of sharp, percussive clicks that moved through the undergrowth with a deliberate rhythm. Not random. Not the noise of animals being startled. This was communication, passed from one point to another in a rough arc that was, Izuku realized with a slow cold clarity, curving around him. He stopped walking. The clicks stopped. The jungle went absolutely silent in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Even the birds had gone quiet. Even the insects. Izuku turned very slowly until he was facing the densest section of fern to his left, maybe 10 meters away. He let one for all bleed through his legs and into his core, not enough to crackle visibly, just enough to coil. He kept his hands loose at his sides. The fern moved. Not from wind. There was no wind. The fronds parted in a very specific way, pushed aside from low down, from something moving with deliberate patience, something that understood that if it moved slowly enough the human eye would categorize it as scenery. It was about 2 meters long from snout to tail, standing roughly chest height when it finally cleared the ferns and stopped. Scaled in amber and black with flecks of iridescent green that shifted when it moved. Its eyes were brilliant gold, rimmed in dark amber, and they were locked on Izuku with an intelligence that had no business being in an animal's face. Not because it was human intelligence, it wasn't, it was something older and more honest than that, but because it was present. Fully, entirely present, the way most people weren't even when they were looking right at you. A velociraptor. She, and something about the bearing, the stillness, the particular quality of the attention told Izuku immediately this was a she, tilted her head roughly 2 degrees to the right and made a sound low in her throat. Not a growl. Something more like a question. 2 more emerged from the ferns behind her, flanking. Slightly smaller. Slightly less still. Their eyes moved where hers didn't. Izuku did not move. What he did was breathe. Long and slow, letting his chest rise and fall visibly, letting one for all settle into his bones like ballast in a ship's hull. He held the lead raptor's gaze and did not look away, because the one thing he understood about predators, from years of facing All Might, Bakugo, Nomu, and everything in between, was that you didn't earn their respect by submitting. You earned it by being something that made submission feel pointless. The lead raptor took 1 step forward. Then another. She stopped with maybe 4 meters between them. Up close, the scars on her snout were visible. One across the left brow ridge. One through the lower jaw. Old wounds, healed into silver-white lines against the amber scale. She'd been in her share of fights and she'd won them all, because she was here, for meters away from him, radiating the particular confidence of something that had never met a problem it couldn't solve. She made the low sound again. Izuku answered. Not with words. He made a sound from the back of his throat, not mimicking, he wasn't that arrogant, but something low and steady, a frequency that said I hear you. I'm not running. I'm not hunting you. I'm here. The raptor went completely still. Her gold eyes moved over him in a single, comprehensive sweep. He could see her processing, not calculating the way a human would, not running game theory scenarios, but doing something faster and more honest than that. She was reading him. The same way he read opponents in a fight, taking in weight distribution, muscle tension, the particular quality of stillness. She was asking herself what kind of thing this was and whether it required a response. Then she did something that her flanking pack members clearly did not expect. She looked away. Not in submission. Not in fear. She looked away the way you look away from something you've already decided about, a deliberate, conscious withdrawal of challenge. She turned her head 45 degrees to the left and made a different sound, sharper, twice. The 2 flanking raptors pulled back immediately, melting back into the undergrowth with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. She looked at Izuku one more time. The expression on a raptor's face was limited by anatomy, but what she managed to communicate in that glance was something so close to acknowledgement that Izuku felt it in his chest. Then she was gone, the ferns settling behind her as if she'd never existed. Izuku let out the breath he'd been holding very, very slowly. Okay, he said again. Hello to you too. He found a river by following the sound of it and spent the better part of an hour moving downstream along its bank, cataloging what he could see and building a map in his head. The park infrastructure was everywhere, but it was old, rusted, cracked, colonized. He passed what had been a guest pathway, the stamped concrete edge of it now a trough for a small waterfall that had developed from ground runoff. He passed a maintenance shed that had been reduced to a roof and 3 walls, the interior hollowed out by something large enough to have shouldered the walls apart. The claw marks on the door frame were as long as his forearm. He also found food, not without effort. A cluster of large tropical fruit he recognized from horticulture studies, a section of the river shallow and clear enough to wade and observe the fish, wild-growing plants he was confident enough to eat from. He was methodical about it, not desperate. This was solvable. Every problem was solvable if you broke it into pieces small enough to hold. By midday he had a rough sense of the landscape. High jungle to the north, transitioning to what looked like open valley. Rocky highlands to the east. The southwest was lower and damper, the kind of terrain that would flood in heavy rain. He needed elevation for visibility and defensibility, which meant east or north. He also needed to understand how this ecosystem was organized, not just where the animals were, but the hierarchy. The structure. Who deferred to whom? He was considering this when the ground shook. Not an earthquake, the tremors were rhythmic. Spaced. Footfalls. Big ones. He looked up and to the east, where the tree line broke slightly against the sky, and he saw her. Even at distance, even partially obscured by the canopy's edge, she was enormous. Her profile was unmistakable, massive skull, tiny arms that somehow communicated more restrained power than they did limitation, the thick pillar of a tail that balanced a body built for nothing less than total dominance. She was moving along the ridgeline at a pace that was almost casual, and she was headed, with no apparent urgency, in Izuku's general direction. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Izuku tracked her movement and calculated the vector. She wasn't coming directly at him, she was angling south of his position by maybe 200 meters. She hadn't spotted him. Or she had, and she wasn't concerned. He couldn't tell which and wasn't sure the distinction mattered yet. He stayed perfectly still and watched her move. She was old. He could see that even at distance, the way she carried her age and the deliberateness of every step, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. A scar ran from her right shoulder across the ridge of her skull, silver-white and long-heeled, catching the noon light. There were other marks too, old bite wounds along the jaw and flanks, the accumulated record of a life spent as the apex. But she moved like she'd been born to carry every one of those marks. Like they were decorations, not damage. She reached the ridgeline break, paused, and turned her head. She looked directly at him. The distance between them was 200 meters of jungle, and she looked at him the way you look at something you've already been thinking about. There was no startle, no reaction. Just a long, measured assessment from eyes the size of dinner plates. Izuku met her gaze. He didn't posture. He didn't flash one for all. He just stood on the riverbank in his shredded costume and looked back, and something passed between them that he wouldn't have been able to explain to another person, the kind of communication that happened below language, in the register of instinct and presence and whatever it was that the universe used to decide which things belonged to which places. She held his gaze for a long count of 10. Then she turned, stepped off the ridgeline, and disappeared into the tree line on the eastern slope. Izuku stood there for a moment, breathing slowly. She hadn't run. She hadn't charged. She hadn't done either of the things a T-Rex was supposed to do when it saw a person standing in the open at midday. She had looked at him the way that lead raptor had looked at him, with the total, comprehensive attention of something deciding. And then she had walked away. Not retreating. Withdrawing. The way a chess player withdraws a hand from a piece they've just chosen carefully. Izuku turned east. He started walking toward the highlands. The raptor found him again 2 hours later. She didn't announce herself, she was simply there when he stepped into a natural clearing, sitting on a flat-topped boulder with her tail curled around her feet and her gold eyes on him with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting a polite amount of time and was prepared to wait more. Her 2 flanking pack members were visible in the tree line, watching. Izuku stopped in the center of the clearing and looked at her. "You followed me," he said. She clicked. "I'm going east," he said. "High ground." She tilted her head. The same 2-degree angle as before. You can come, he said, not like he was granting permission and not like he was inviting a pet. More like acknowledging a colleague's presence at a meeting. I'm not going to tell you what to do. She made a different sound, shorter, flatter, and jumped down from the boulder with a grace that her size didn't suggest was possible. She landed without a sound and shook herself once, the way a dog shakes after a swim, then looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated she was ready to move when he was. Izuku turned east and walked. She fell into step on his left, roughly 2 meters out, maintaining that spacing with the consistent precision of something that had decided on a number and committed to it. After another few minutes one of the flanking pack members moved up to a position on his right, slightly further back. The third stayed in the rear. He didn't look back to check. He could feel them. I'm going to call you Vela, he said to the lead raptor, because she reminded him of something fast and navigational and precise, a name that suited the gold compass quality of her attention. If you don't like it, you can tell me. She made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been dismissal and was probably both. The highlands were everything he'd hoped, a broken plateau of volcanic rock crested with dense jungle, elevated enough to give sightlines over the valley below and the coast to the west. He could see the remnants of the main park from here, collapsed visitor structures, the rusted arc of what had been a monorail track, the vast concrete basin of what looked like a lagoon attraction, now full of something that moved darkly through still water. He also found, tucked into the eastern face of the plateau, a maintenance structure that had survived better than most. 3 solid concrete walls, a partial fourth, a roof that was mostly intact. No doors left, but the walls were standing. It was defensible, dry, and had a secondary access through a collapsed section that only someone who knew it was there would find. He spent the remainder of daylight clearing it out. Vela watched from outside, occasionally clicking instructions to her pack members with an efficiency that suggested she was coordinating something. He didn't ask. She'd tell him if it was relevant to him. By the time the sun was threading long orange light through the canopy, he had a camp. Rudimentary, functional, honest. A fire built in a stone circle he assembled from the plateau rock, fed with dry brush and kept small enough to provide heat without broadcasting position from a distance. A bedroll improvised from salvaged materials from the maintenance structure supply cabinet, still sealed, still dry, containing a folded emergency tarp that was worth more than everything else combined. He sat at the fire's edge and ate the fruit he'd collected, watching the valley darken below him. Vela sat across the fire from him. The firelight caught her scales and turned the amber to copper, the black to deep violet. She was watching him with that gold-eyed steadiness, and there was something in it that wasn't hunter watching prey and wasn't predator assessing threat. It was something else. Something he recognized from years of training in competition and battle, the look of someone who had found a situation genuinely, unexpectedly interesting. I'm from somewhere else, he told her. Not because she asked. Because the silence felt like it had space for words. Long way from here. Don't know if I'm going back. She clicked once. I'm not sad about it, he said, and discovered as he said it that this was mostly true. I've spent my whole life trying to fit somewhere. Trying to prove I was worth including. He watched a log in the fire settle and send a column of sparks spiraling upward. Nobody here seems to care much about my quirk registration. Vela made a sound he hadn't heard from her before, a low, rolling sound that started in her chest and moved up into a resonant hum. It wasn't a purr, exactly, but it served a similar emotional function. An acknowledgement. A kind of warmth. The second pack raptor, smaller and quicker than the flanking one, with a pale stripe along her jaw, emerged from the tree lean and lay down roughly 6 meters away, curling her tail up and tucking her head down with the efficiency of something that had found a safe place to sleep. The third followed a minute later, choosing a position that put him between the fire and the eastern approach. Sentries. Without being asked. Izuku looked at Vela. You're organized, he said. She blinked once, slowly. Yes. Obviously. He lay back against the wall of the maintenance structure and looked up through the gap in the canopy where the stars were beginning to burn through. The air smelled like rain coming. He could hear the valley sounds building toward their nighttime register, the deeper calls, the longer silences, the sense of the island's diurnal rhythm shifting over. Somewhere to the east, something large made a sound that rolled through the rock of the plateau like a bass note from an instrument too big to see. Deep and resonant and absolute. Rexa. He knew it without knowing how he knew it. The same way he'd known the raptors were circling him before he saw them. The same way he'd known the T-Rex on the ridgeline hadn't been deciding whether to attack but deciding something else entirely. The call came again, closer this time, from somewhere below the plateau's east face. Not aggressive. Not hunting. The kind of sound that said I know you're there. The kind of sound that said this conversation isn't over. Not tonight, Izuku said quietly, to the dark and the stars and the island that had decided to pay such close attention to him. He closed his eyes. In the morning, everything would begin. He woke before dawn to the sound of running. Not his own running, the sound of someone else's, human footfalls on concrete and undergrowth, accompanied by the controlled breathing of trained movement. His eyes opened completely before his body moved, one for all already threading through his muscles with the automatic readiness of 10 years of fighting. Two people. Moving fast along the lower face of the plateau, east to west, using the old maintenance path that ran along the base of the rock. Not running from something, running toward. The sound was too controlled, too rhythmic for panic. This was tactical movement. He was on his feet and at the plateau's edge before the fire was even properly out of his peripheral vision, crouching at the rim and looking down. Two figures in dark tactical gear, moving with professional efficiency. Armed, he could see the slung weapons, compact and sophisticated, not simple firearms. One of them carried a device on their back that he didn't recognize. The other was checking a handheld screen as they ran, calling quiet corrections to the first. They weren't looking up. Neither of them had spotted the three raptors sleeping 30 meters away from him. Vela appeared at his left shoulder like she'd materialized from the rock itself, and he felt the shift in her presence, the warm loose-limbed quality of a predator at rest replaced in an instant by the wire-tight precision of a predator tracking. She looked at the figures below and then at him, and the question was clear. He shook his head once. Not yet. She was still, but she watched. The two figures passed along the base of the plateau without slowing, heading west, and the sound of them faded into the pre-dawn dark. Izuku stayed at the rim for a full minute after they were gone, listening. They weren't alone on this island. He'd known that, probably, he just needed confirmation. The park's history was complicated, the corporate lineage even more so, and the island itself had a gravity that attracted exactly the kind of people who should stay away from it. He turned and looked at Vela in the first gray light of almost dawn. "Company," he said. She made the flat, short sound again, the one that meant obvious, and turned back toward the fire. He almost smiled. There was something about this that felt less like a problem and more like a context. He'd arrived here without a plan, without a map, without a single ally who spoke his language, and in less than a day he had a defensible position, a scouted food supply, sightlines over most of the island's accessible terrain, and a raptor pack that was sleeping in a security formation around his camp without him asking them to. He also had a T-Rex who had looked at him twice and hadn't eaten him. Whatever this island wanted from him, it had already decided he was the right person for the job. He wasn't inclined to argue. He went back to the fire, added wood, and started thinking about the day. The valley below the plateau was the key. Control the valley, control access to the highlands, control the water and the food channels that fed through the lower jungle. He needed to understand its layout, not from above, from inside. He needed to know where the other predators were ranging, where the herds moved, what the territorial boundaries looked like and where they were weakening. He also needed to know who those two figures worked for and what the device on the second one's back was designed to do. Both of those things meant going down into the valley today. Vela sat beside the fire and watched him think. The two pack members were awake now, alert, watching the eastern approach with the automatic professionalism of a unit that had done this many mornings before. The small one with the jaw stripe, he was already thinking of her as Sift, for the quick precise way she moved through underbrush, had found something in the outer tree line and was examining it with focused curiosity. The larger flanking male, Crest, he decided, for the prominent brow ridge, had positioned himself at the plateau's north edge and was scanning the valley with his whole body canted slightly forward, reading the air. A unit. Not tamed. Not commanded. A unit that had decided, collectively and apparently overnight, that this was a worthwhile arrangement. He wasn't going to take that lightly. "All right," he said, mostly to himself, standing and rolling his shoulders until the joints cracked satisfyingly. One for all woke at the flex of it, a comfortable warmth that spread through his back and arms. "Let's see what we've got." He walked to the plateau's edge and looked out over the valley as the sun began to climb. The mist was thick down there, filling the low spaces between the trees like slow white water, and through it he could see movement, large shapes, plural, moving with the unhurried ease of animals that had nothing to fear from anything. A herd, probably hadrosaurs from the profile, moving along the valley's western edge. Above the mist line, a pair of something with wide wingspans was circling on the thermal that rose from the heated rock of the plateau, too far away to identify clearly. And at the valley's center, where the mist was thickest, something was standing still. Something enormous. He could just make out the shape of it, the immense vertical profile, the long curved claws that caught the morning light even through the mist. It was standing at the valley's heart with its back to him, facing west, and it was so still that he'd almost categorized it as a rock formation before one of the claws moved, a slow deliberate arc through the mist. That wasn't a rock. He'd seen illustrations, everyone had, the park's marketing had been comprehensive before everything collapsed. He knew what a Therizinosaurus looked like. He knew the size and the claws and the particular quality of menace that came wrapped in an herbivore's body. He did not know it would feel like that from this distance. Like standing at the edge of a weather system. Like proximity to something that had decided, long ago, that the world would simply arrange itself around its preferences. Vela appeared at his right elbow and clicked 3 times in quick succession. He was learning her vocabulary fast enough that he understood this one. "I see it. I know it. Be careful." "Is it dangerous?" he asked, knowing she couldn't answer in any way he could parse, but asking because sometimes the act of asking was useful. She looked at him. Then she looked at the valley. Then she looked at him again, and the expression in those gold eyes was something he was going to think about for a long time, because it was the same expression he'd seen on Toshinori's face, near the end. The expression of something that had seen a great many things, survived most of them, and was arriving at a considered opinion about whether this new thing was a threat or a truth. She clicked once. Soft. Almost respectful. The Therizinosaurus in the valley shifted, turned slightly, and though the distance was too great for eye contact to be meaningful, Izuku felt the attention shift. Something on this island was paying attention to him. All of it. All at once. He took a breath and let one for all settle into every muscle, steady and vast and warm, the power he'd carried since he was 16 years old, the power of every person who'd ever held it and chosen to use it for something worth using it for. The island wanted to know what he was. He was going to show it. "Let's go down," he said. Vela dropped off the plateau's edge before he'd finished the sentence, hitting the lower slope in 3 bounding strides. Crest and Sift fell in behind her with automatic precision. Izuku crouched at the edge for 1 beat, feeling the morning air on his face, watching the mist move in the valley below. Then he stepped off, let one for all catch him in the landing 30 feet down, and followed his pack into the jungle. The island woke around him as he descended, all its vast and patient attention gathering toward the valley floor like weather toward a horizon. Whatever was waiting down there, it was waiting for him specifically. And he was done keeping anything waiting. Chapter 2, Queen of Claws. The valley floor was a different world. Up on the plateau, the jungle had a certain openness to it, light came through in shafts, the canopy had gaps, the rock gave everything a clean edge. Down here, the canopy closed overhead like a cathedral ceiling that had decided it didn't want visitors, and the light arrived filtered through so many layers of green that it had a quality somewhere between dusk and dream. Everything was larger than it had any right to be. Ferns at shoulder height. Tree roots that arched over the path like the ribs of something buried. Moss that covered every surface in a thick velvet silence that swallowed footsteps whole. Izuku moved through it at a pace that felt natural, letting the ground tell him where to step. One for all was steady in his muscles, not active, just present, the way your hands know a familiar weight without you having to think about it. Vela moved 5 meters to his left, threading through the undergrowth with a fluid economy that made his own movement feel loud, and Crest and Sift were somewhere in the green behind him, invisible but audible in the specific way that trusted allies are audible, barely, and intentionally. The mist was thicker here. It moved between the tree trunks in long slow ribbons, chest height, and it muffled the valley sounds into something soft and directionless. He could hear the hadrosaur herd somewhere to the northwest, the low rhythmic calls they used to maintain contact in low visibility, a sound like someone striking a very large hollow log. He could hear water. He could hear, faintly, the creak and groan of something enormous moving through undergrowth. Ahead. He stopped. Vela stopped at the same instant, without any signal from him. He didn't know yet if that was coincidence or if she was reading something from his body that he wasn't consciously putting there. He suspected the latter. The sound had come from roughly 40 meters north-northeast, deep, slow, the particular sound of something large navigating undergrowth without caring very much whether the undergrowth minded. The sound of a creature that had decided, categorically, that the concept of obstacles was not personally applicable to it. Then the smell hit him. Not a bad smell, that was the first thing. It was green and complex, layered with something almost mineral, like fresh rain on volcanic rock, undercut with a warmer animal note that was specific and unmistakable in the way that all apex predators had a specific, unmistakable smell. His brain catalogued it automatically, the same way it catalogued movement in his peripheral vision during a fight. New data. Add to the map. Wait for more context. The undergrowth 30 meters ahead split apart. She emerged from it the way weather emerges from the horizon, gradually, and then all at once. First the claws, each one longer than Izuku was tall, curved like the blades of some agricultural implement designed for a world where the harvest was made of mountains. Then the neck, long and deliberate and absolutely unhurried, supporting a head that swung in a slow arc as she cleared the tree line. Then the body, massive and deep-chested, covered in thick overlapping scales that were the particular dusty sage green of old jungle, patterns of darker green and brown running along the flanks in irregular bands that in the mist made her look like a piece of landscape that had decided to stand up and walk. Therizinosaurus. Full-grown female. Maybe 14 meters from the tip of those extraordinary claws to the end of her tail. She stepped fully into the clearing created by her own passage, regarded the space she'd just made with the mild satisfaction of someone who had arranged their furniture to their liking, and then looked at Izuku. He looked back. Something in him wanted to reach for one for all and he let that impulse arrive and pass without acting on it. Not because she wasn't dangerous, she was obviously, extraordinarily dangerous, the clause alone being the kind of argument that ended most conversations immediately. But reaching for power in this moment would be the wrong language. It would say threat, and she hadn't said threat. She'd said something else entirely. She'd said I know you're here. I've been waiting. That was the thing about her that hit him hardest. Not the size, not the claws, not the absolute authority of her presence. It was the waiting quality of her attention, as if she'd received some advance information about his arrival and had arranged her morning accordingly, and was now assessing whether the reality matched the briefing. He took one step toward her. Behind him, he felt Vela's attention spike, a sudden sharp alertness that communicated "Are you serious right now?" with absolute clarity. He didn't stop. He took another step, and another, closing the distance by 10 meters before he stopped again and stood, loose and easy, with 20 meters of mist-threaded air between himself and something that could remove him from the planet with a single casual swing. The Therizinosaurus lowered her head. Not quickly. Everything she did was unhurried to a degree that in lesser creatures would have read as slow, but in her read as deliberate. Purposeful. She lowered her head until one enormous eye was at roughly Izuku's eye level, positioned maybe 15 meters away, and she looked at him with an intelligence that was different from Vela's focused, tactical brightness. Where Vela's intelligence was sharp and quick like a blade catching light, hers was deep and still, like water in a cave. Something that had been sitting with its own thoughts for a very long time and was not inconvenienced by the need to share them. Izuku met her eye. He breathed slowly and let her read whatever she was reading, the smell of him, the way he held himself, the energy that one for all put into his presence whether he was actively using it or not. He'd always given off something, that much he'd known since childhood. Something that certain people, and apparently certain animals, could sense. All Might had said once, near the end of a training session, that Izuku reminded him of a fire that had learned to be careful. Not banked, not diminished. Careful. Precise about where it chose to burn. The Therizinosaurus made a sound. It was low enough that he felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears, a resonant, rolling vibration that moved through the mist and the ground and the air simultaneously. Not a threat display. Not a warning. The closest human analog he could find for it was the sound of a judgment being delivered by someone who had taken all the time they needed to be absolutely certain. Then she straightened up, turned her head forward, and walked. Not at him. Past him, angling northwest, toward the hadrosaur herd, moving through the mist with that same vast unhurried authority. He turned and watched her go, the great claws swinging in slow arcs, the tail counterbalancing with perfect mechanical grace, the sage-green body dissolving into the mist in layers until she was gone. Vela materialized at his shoulder. She chose, he said. He didn't phrase it as a question because it didn't feel like one. Vela clicked twice. Theoria, he decided, and felt immediately that the name was right in some way he couldn't articulate, something about the weight of it, the way it occupied space. He found the first sign of active human presence 40 minutes later, and it wasn't the patrol he'd watched from the plateau. It was a sensor array. Small, camouflaged, bolted to the base of a tree at knee height with hardware that was clearly engineered for concealment, the casing matched the bark texture almost perfectly, and the indicator light, if there was one, wasn't visible. He only spotted it because he'd been watching for exactly this, the small, precise wrongness that manufactured things carry in the middle of wild spaces. A right angle where the world preferred curves. A surface texture too consistent to be natural. He crouched and studied it without touching it. Motion sensor, almost certainly. Possibly thermal. If it was networked, and gear this quality usually was, someone had just received an alert that something was in this grid square. Something that moved with a human-sized heat signature. He straightened up and looked at the tree lean. Vela was looking at the sensor with frank disgust, the same expression she'd worn when he'd eaten his morning fruit too slowly. She clicked at it once, dismissively. "How many of these did you walk past with me?" he asked. She looked at him. "Right." He filed that away. She'd navigated him around some of them, probably, without him knowing. Which meant she understood what they were, or at least understood that they were the kind of thing humans put in the jungle when they wanted to find out where other things were. He started moving again, faster now, changing his route to put maximum tree coverage between himself and the open sky. If the sensor array was feeding data to a monitoring station, they'd have a position fix in minutes. He didn't know the island's layout well enough yet to want a confrontation on someone else's terms. Not because he was worried about the outcome, but because a fight before he had full situational awareness was sloppy, and sloppy was something he had no patience for. He'd covered roughly 300 meters when he heard the transports. Two of them, the distinctive whine of electric motors pushed hard, moving through the jungle on a bearing that would intersect his current path in about 90 seconds. He angled right, deeper into the undergrowth, and put a dense stand of tree ferns between himself and the path. Vela had already vanished. He didn't worry about her. The first transport broke through the undergrowth and stopped 20 meters from his position, a low-profile six-wheeled thing, matte dark green, with a forward-facing camera array and 2 armed personnel in the open cab. The second was identical and parked to flank the first's position. A third person stepped out of the second transport and looked at a tablet, frowning. She was tall, early 40s, dark hair pulled back with the functional neatness of someone who didn't have time for aesthetics but also didn't have time for hair in their eyes. She wore the same dark gear as the others but without a weapon, which told Izuku more about her confidence in the people around her than it did about her own capabilities. Her posture was precise. A scientist's posture, the kind that came from years of leaning over benches and making small, exact corrections. The signal was here, she said. Her voice was calm and articulate and projected without effort, a voice that was accustomed to being listened to. Check the grid. One of the armed personnel dropped out of the first transport and started moving through the area with a scanner, passing within 8 meters of Izuku's position without looking up from the device. The woman, Izuku was already certain she was the one who mattered here, in this group, turned in a slow circle, reading the space the way he read spaces. The way a professional reads spaces. She stopped when she was facing northeast and tilted her head slightly. Raptor sign, she said, pointing at a disturbed patch of fern without looking at the scanner operator. 3 animals, maybe 4. They were here recently. That's not unusual for this grid, one of the transport crew said. The thermal signature was human-sized and bipedal, she said. That's what's unusual for this grid. She turned the tablet toward the crew member and he squinted at it. It moved with purpose. Not panic. Not flight. It arrived, paused here, she pointed at the sensor array's location, for approximately 30 seconds, and then left with a course correction. Someone found the sensor. The crew member looked at the jungle with a new quality of attention. The woman did not look at the jungle. She looked at the tablet. Then she looked up at the space between the trees, the canopy, the sky, the middle distance, and she said, quietly and to no one in particular, interesting. She lowered the tablet, and for one moment her gaze swept across Izuku's position with the flat, comprehensive look of someone checking off items on a list. He was certain she couldn't see him. The coverage was too good, the light too broken, his stillness too practiced. But he filed the look away anyway, because it was exactly the kind of look that very smart people wore when they were assembling a picture from incomplete information and didn't want you to know how close to complete the picture was getting. Pull the sensor array and redeploy on a 40-meter offset, she said, already turning back to the transport. I want seismic monitors added to this grid by 1800. Whatever this is, it knows we're watching, so let's watch differently. She climbed into the transport with the unhurried economy of someone who'd already moved on to the next problem, and both vehicles reversed and disappeared back into the jungle. Izuku waited another full minute before moving. Vela emerged from a completely different position than she'd vanished from, northwest, already repositioned, already watching the direction the transports had gone. She clicked once. They're gone. She's smart, Izuku said. Vela made the dismissive single click. Being smart doesn't make something safe, he said, and Vela's expression indicated that this was not new information and she was mildly offended he'd felt the need to say it. He almost smiled again. It was becoming a habit. He found Theria again in the afternoon. She hadn't sought him out this time. He'd followed the herd sounds northwest and found her at the valley's center, standing in a grove of massive cycads that came up to her chest, eating with the focused efficiency of something that needed a staggering amount of calories every day and wasn't precious about how it got them. The hadrosaur herd was grazing 200 meters further west, apparently unconcerned. She ignored them with the completeness of something that had never found hadrosaurs relevant to any of its plans. He sat down on a fallen tree at the grove's edge and watched her eat. She knew he was there. The slight change in the angle of her neck when he arrived told him that. She didn't stop eating or acknowledge him beyond that small adjustment, which he found, oddly, deeply comfortable. There was something profoundly honest about it. I know you're there, you know I know, no performance required from either of us. Vela sat beside him, which was starting to feel normal enough that he noted it with the background attention rather than the foreground. She picked me this morning, he said, not really to Vela, more to the air. Vela clicked. Before I'd done anything, she'd already decided. Another click. You did the same thing. A pause. Then a different sound, the rolling chest sound he was starting to identify as agreement with a qualifier. Yes, but you tested me, he said. She didn't. He thought about that for a while. About what it meant to be read at that depth, that quickly. About what information a creature like Theria was drawing on that he couldn't see or measure or replicate. The island, he thought. The island was involved in this at a level he didn't have the framework to fully understand yet. Something in this place had its own logic, its own order, and that order was currently doing something that felt very much like recognizing him. After a few minutes, Theria turned her head and looked at him directly. He raised one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement. She regarded the gesture with the particular solemnity of something that didn't do symbolic gestures itself but was prepared to understand them in others. Then she went back to eating. Theria, he said. She didn't look up, but one massive claw turned slightly, a minimal motion that somehow managed to communicate acceptable. They were heading back toward the plateau when the screaming started. Not human screaming. The sound of a raptor in distress, high and sharp and carrying a frequency that cut through all the ambient jungle noise like a blade. Vela went rigid beside him, and in the same instant the quality of her attention transformed completely. Every loose, fluid aspect of her vanished. She became a single point of purpose, locked onto the sounds bearing with absolute precision. East. Maybe 500 meters. He was running before he'd consciously decided to run. One for all was already live in his legs, throwing him through the jungle at a speed that reduced the undergrowth to a blur, branches catching and tearing at his arms, and he didn't slow down, didn't redirect, pushed through it all with the focused ruthlessness of someone for whom obstacles were temporary. Vela was ahead of him, somehow, even at this speed. She knew this jungle in her bones, every path and channel, and she threaded through it with an efficiency that made his own progress look like swimming through sand. But he wasn't far behind. 400 meters. 3. 2. He heard the transport before he saw it. The same electric motor whine from the morning, stationary now, and over it a human voice calling coordinates and something else, a high-pitched pulse, regular and rapid, that he identified half a second before he broke through the tree-line as a sonic disorientation device. The kind of thing that scrambled inner ear function, that turned a precisely coordinated pack animal into a thrashing, terrified individual. He emerged into a natural clearing and took in everything at once. 3 humans. 2 transports. A circular metal enclosure, portable, assembled fast, the kind of thing designed to collapse down for transport and deploy in minutes. Inside it, one of Vela's pack. He didn't know which one from the distance, but the size said Crest, the big male, the sentry, the one who'd been watching the valley at dawn with that forward-canted professionalism. He was on his side in the enclosure, legs churning against nothing, the sonic device mounted on the enclosure's frame still pulsing. One of the 3 humans was monitoring the enclosure controls. The other 2 were perimeter, weapons up, watching the tree line with the trained awareness of professionals who expected the jungle to respond to what they'd done. It had. Vela hit the right side perimeter guard before he could complete his turn, a collision that was less attack than physics. 150 kilos of raptor at full sprint meets a standing human, and there is only one outcome. He went down hard and Vela was already gone, repositioning, using her speed and the undergrowth as cover. The second perimeter guard spun, weapon tracking, and found Izuku standing in the clearing. Not running toward them. Standing. Loose and easy, maybe 20 meters out, one for all humming quietly in his bones without showing on his skin, watching the scene with the comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. Drop the sonic device, he said. The guard who was monitoring the enclosure controls looked up sharply. The perimeter guard kept his weapon on Izuku with the trained steadiness of someone who'd had some form of close encounters before and had learned not to be impressed by people who stood in the open and issued instructions. "Identify yourself," the perimeter guard said. "I'm the reason your first sensor alert said human-sized bipedal," Izuku said. "Drop the device. We can talk after." The monitor guard reached for something at his belt, a secondary weapon, or a comms device, he couldn't tell which. Izuku was crossing the clearing before the hand completed the reach, one for all, taking him across 20 meters in roughly a second and a half, not at full power, at the precise level required to be somewhere before the person watching expected him to be there. He caught the guard's wrist with enough pressure to communicate seriousness without breaking anything, stepped past him, leaned over the enclosure controls, and killed the sonic device. The pulsing stopped. In the enclosure, Crest went still, breathing hard, legs drawn under him. He wasn't injured, not badly. Disoriented and exhausted and furious in the very specific way that proud animals get furious when they've been humiliated by something they couldn't fight. The perimeter guard still had his weapon up. Izuku had his back to it. He didn't turn around. "I know you're deciding," he said to the perimeter guard, releasing the monitor guard's wrist. "Let me help. You're professionals, which means you're calculating outcomes. Your colleague is down," he nodded toward where Vela had gone, where the first perimeter guard was picking himself up from the jungle floor, dazed but intact, "and you don't know how many raptors are in this tree line. You do know that I crossed 20 meters before your partner could complete a draw. That's your full information set." A long silence. "Open the enclosure," the perimeter guard said. Not to Izuku. To the monitor guard. Izuku turned and looked at him then, because that was the right response, rational, professional, and it deserved acknowledgement. The guard's face was hard and closed, giving away nothing, but the calculation was visible in the way he'd reframed the entire situation in about 4 seconds. This person was good at his job. The monitor guard opened the enclosure. Crest came out in a rush and immediately pressed himself against the tree line, clicking rapidly, the raptor equivalent of shouting. Vela appeared from the undergrowth and intercepted him, clicking back with the flat, authoritative speed of a commander running a debrief. He wasn't hurt. She needed him functional. He settled, gradually, into the sharp-edged alert that was the best currently available option. The first perimeter guard had gotten himself upright and was watching Vela with the expression of someone who had reclassified an event very recently and was still processing the new category. Izuku looked at the three of them. "Who sent you?" he asked. The perimeter guard looked at his partner. Something passed between them, a professional calculation about information security and what the current situation did and didn't require. "Environmental asset recovery," the monitor guard said finally. "Rogue pack behavior. This unit left its registered territory." "Registered territory," Izuku repeated. "The park's management framework, what's left of it, tracks the surviving population by sectors. When animals leave their logged sectors, they're flagged for relocation." "By who?" The perimeter guard said nothing. "The name on your gear is Harken," Izuku said, because it was, stenciled on the chest plate in letters small enough to require the close proximity he'd just been at. "Are you Harken?" "A beat." "No." "Who is?" The monitor guard glanced at the perimeter guard again. The perimeter guard said, "Commander Harken leads our tactical division." "And who does Commander Harken report to?" No answer. Izuku looked at the enclosure, at the sonic device mounted on its frame, at the design of it, not cobbled together, not improvised. Manufactured. Custom. Someone had designed a device specifically for this use case, which meant someone had anticipated this use case, which meant this operation had infrastructure and planning and resources behind it. "Tell whoever you report to," Izuku said, "that Crest's territory now extends to the eastern valley. All of it. And the plateau above it." He looked from one to the other. "The raptor pack isn't rogue. They're exactly where they're supposed to be." He turned and walked back into the jungle, and Vela fell into step beside him, and Crest limped into position on his right with the dignity of something that had been knocked down and was absolutely not going to acknowledge that it had been knocked down. Behind them, Izuku heard the monitor guard say quietly to the perimeter guard, "Are we going to report this?" The perimeter guard said, "Every word." He was almost back to the plateau when Theria appeared. She came out of the western undergrowth and fell into a pace parallel to his path, 30 meters out, moving through the jungle like weather. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She was simply there, placing herself in a position that said, without words or ceremony, "I know what just happened and I'm walking with you now." He looked over at her massive profile threading through the trees and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized, eventually, as gratitude, not the polite, transactional kind, but the deep and slightly uncomfortable kind that came from being witnessed by something that owed you nothing. "Thank you," he said. She swung one claw in a slow arc and said nothing, because she was Theria, and she didn't explain her choices to anyone. He climbed the plateau as the sun went red and horizontal, the valley going gold below him and the mist burning off and the island spreading out in every direction like it was showing him something. Like it was saying, "Look at the size of what you're standing in the middle of." He looked. The valley was enormous, easily 3 kilometers at its widest. The highland plateau ran along its eastern edge like a spine. To the north, the terrain broke into rougher country, rocky outcroppings and densely forested slopes climbing toward what looked like a cliff system that dropped to the coast. To the south, the old park infrastructure clustered thickest, the ruins of the visitor experience, the bones of the civilization that had failed here. And somewhere in all of it, a woman with a tablet and a scientist's posture was redeploying her sensor arrays on a 40-meter offset and adding seismic monitors to the eastern grid. He sat at the plateau's edge and watched the sun go down and thought about what he was building here. Not the territory was just geography, inert until something lived in it with intention. What he was building was something more like a language. The island had its own grammar, its own structure of understanding, and he was learning to read and write in it with every interaction, every choice, every moment of standing still when everything expected him to run. Vela sat behind him, close enough that he could hear her breathing. Sift and Crest were nearby. Crest was still, but the tension in him had mostly released now, replaced with the particular quality of anger that had nowhere to go and was being converted, slowly, into resolve. Izuku understood that feeling entirely. "You're going to be okay," he told Crest, not turning around. A long pause. Then a single click, quiet and deliberate. "I know." The stars came out above the valley, the same stars as home but arranged in a slightly different register. He was below the equator here, the sky rotated, the constellations shifted. Different sky, same stars, new arrangement. Fitting. He'd fallen into a new arrangement and was finding, surprisingly, that he fit in it. The question was who else wanted to rearrange it before he was done. The woman with the tablet. The operation she represented. The infrastructure behind the sonic device and the sensors and the tactical personnel moving through his jungle with professional efficiency. He would need to understand all of it. Not to defend himself, that was secondary, almost irrelevant. But because whatever they wanted it from this place, and this place was in the process of becoming something he was responsible for. He felt that responsibility settle into him alongside everything else, alongside one for all and the memory of every person who'd invested in him and the island's vast, patient attention. It didn't feel like a burden. It felt like what he'd been waiting for. Chapter 3, The Sky Belongs to the Bold. He heard the northern cliffs before he saw them. 3 days of valley work had given him enough of the island's grammar to start reading sentences. The hadrosaur herd moved in a circuit, southeast pasture in the morning, northwest waterway by midday, back to the valley's center by dusk. Theria's territory was the cycad grove and everything within a kilometer of it, but she ranged further when she felt like it, and nobody argued with her when she did. The sensor arrays that the woman, he'd started thinking of her as Voss, just Voss, the way you named a weather system to make it easier to track, had redeployed were visible to Vela's pack now, and Vela had been systematically routing them around the arrays with a methodical patience that suggested she'd been doing this kind of thing long before Izuku arrived. The Northern Territory was different. The sounds that came from that direction had a quality none of the valley sounds had, a hollowness, an echo, as if the air up there was moving through carved spaces, through rock corridors and open cliff faces where the wind had its own opinions. And underneath that, threading through the wind sounds like a dark needle through pale cloth, something that wasn't wind at all. Calling. High and carrying and sharp-edged at the peaks in a way that put a very specific image in his mind. Wings. He told Vela he was going north. She made the flat dismissive click, her vocabulary for obvious, he decided, because she used it exclusively when he stated things she'd already concluded. Alone, he added. That got a different response. She turned to look at him with both eyes at once, which raptors didn't do unless the situation required the full investment of their attention, and the expression on her face was something between professional concern and personal objection. I need to do this one differently, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She was smart enough to understand that some negotiations required a specific kind of vulnerability, and showing up to aerial territory with a pack at your back was the wrong language for the conversation he needed to have. She didn't like it. Her entire posture said she didn't like it, said she had a comprehensive list of reasons why this was tactically unsound and she would be happy to share them at length. She looked away. Fine. But I'm logging my objection. Noted, he said, and went north. The terrain changed fast. Within an hour of leaving the valley, the dense lowland jungle began to thin and the ground began to rise, the volcanic rock pushing up through the soil in long irregular ridges that got more frequent and more prominent the further north he went. The trees here were different, shorter, wind-shaped, their canopies all pointing south like they were trying to lean away from something. The ferns gave way to tough grasses and low scrub that clung to the rock with the determined ingenuity of things that had no other options. And the wind. The wind-up here was a character in its own right, not the still, laden air of the valley but something active and changeable, coming off the ocean in long rolling gusts that carried salt and the particular cold clarity of open water. It hit him when he crested the first major ridge and suddenly there was nothing between him and the sky up here was enormous, a wide pale blue swept almost clean of cloud, and against it, circling on the thermals that rose from the heated cliff faces, were shapes. Big shapes. He counted 6 in the first pass. Then more, some lower, some higher, some moving in long lazy spirals and some cutting fast and direct across the thermal, banking on wingspans that caught the morning light like sails. Pteranodons, he was nearly certain, though the size of some of them pushed against what he'd thought he knew. One of the higher ones was truly vast, wingspan maybe 8 or 9 meters, riding a thermal with such consummate ease that it barely moved its wings at all, just tilted and adjusted, using the air as a medium with the total unself-consciousness of something that had never needed to think about flying. He watched them for a while from the ridge, not moving, not announcing himself, just watching. The cliffs ahead of him were dramatic, sheer volcanic faces dropping maybe 60 meters to a rocky shoreline where the ocean hit with an enthusiasm that sent spray halfway up the rock. Along the cliff top, ledges and alcoves and the openings of natural chambers carved by wind and water over thousands of years. The pteranodons used all of it, roosting on the ledges, launching from the alcoves, returning from over the water with the particular loaded flight of something that had been hunting and succeeded. This was a colony. A real one, organized and functional, with the kind of internal structure that revealed itself only when you watched long enough. The smaller animals deferred to the larger ones at certain ledges. The hunting flights followed specific corridors. The calls that moved through the colony were varied and purposeful, not noise, not alarm, but communication. And the biggest one, the vast one riding the highest thermal, never descended. Not once, in the 20 minutes he watched. She circled and tilted and adjusted, and occasionally one of the others rose toward her altitude and she made a sound, not the sharp calls of the others, something lower and more complex, and the ascending animal banked away and descended again without pushing further. Queen of the Sky. He was going to have to go to her, because she clearly wasn't coming to him. He looked at the cliff edge, at the 60-meter drop to the ocean, at the thermals that made the air above the cliff face visible in the shimmer and dance of heated air currents. He started walking toward the edge. The thermal hit him 5 meters from the drop, a column of warm rising air that pushed against his chest and lifted the hair from his forehead with a buoyancy that was almost inviting. He stopped right at the edge, toes of his boots over the rim, and looked up. The big one was up there, maybe 200 meters above him. She'd shifted her circle. He'd noticed it in the last few minutes of his approach, the spiral had tightened, the center of it had moved. She was directly above him now, and she'd been moving there gradually since he'd walked onto the cliff top, which told him she'd been watching him since he crested the first ridge. Which meant she'd been aware of his approach before he'd known she was there. Good. He looked up at her for a long count. Then he stepped off the cliff. One for all exploded through his legs as he fell, reversing the drop into a launch, not straight up, angled, using the thermal to carry him outward and up in a long arcing trajectory that took him off the cliff face and into open air. He didn't have wings. What he had was a body that could take its own weight at 200 kilometers an hour and a quirk that could negotiate with physics when the situation called for it. The wind took him immediately, not fighting him, threading through his trajectory and adjusting it with the indifference of something that moved everything through this space equally. He came up out of the initial launch at the apex of the arc, maybe 30 meters above the cliff top, and for a moment he was simply suspended, the ocean below him, the island behind him, the sky everywhere, and the wind making its specific argument against the concept of staying still. He let one for all breathe through his whole body at once, a full-body activation that crackled green at his fingertips and lit his veins and made him glow, just slightly, in the morning light. Not a weapon. Just a presence. The full size of what he was, made visible, offered to the sky without pretense. The big pteranodon stooped. Not a hunting stoop, not the wing-folded plummet of something that had locked onto prey. This was a controlled descent, wings still spread but angled, trading altitude for speed in a long powerful glide that brought her down from 200 meters to 50 in about 4 seconds, and she leveled off and crossed his position at a distance of maybe 20 meters, turning her head to look at him as she passed, and he looked back. She was extraordinary up close. The crest alone was nearly a meter tall, deep russet red at the base shading to orange at the tip, catching the sunlight with the theatrical confidence of something that had evolved to be looked at and had fully embraced that fact. Her eyes were amber, not the bright gold of Vela's eyes but something warmer, deeper, the amber of old resin with light moving through it. And they were locked on him with an attention that was different from Theria's still assessment or Vela's sharp tactical read. This was curiosity. Direct, unguarded, utterly unself-conscious curiosity, the kind that belonged to creatures too proud to pretend they weren't interested. She banked at the end of her pass and came around again, this time closer. 10 meters. Close enough that he could feel the pressure of displaced air as she went by, close enough to see the individual scale patterns on her beak and the way her wingtips flexed and adjusted with micro-corrections too fast to consciously follow. He was falling through the second half of his arc now, the thermals slowing his descent, one for all managing the rest. He let her see all of it, the green light, the arc, the fact that he'd simply walked off a cliff to come up here and have this conversation. He had no interest in pretending to be something he wasn't, not to anything on this island. She came around a third time and this time she didn't pass. She angled in and matched his trajectory, drawing alongside him with the casual precision of something that had complete spatial mastery over 3 dimensions, and she looked at him from 10 meters away while they both moved through the same column of air and the ocean moved far below. Izuku looked back and said, "I know. I don't have wings either. I make do." She made a sound. Short, high, carrying. The same sound she'd used to turn the ascending animals away, but directed at him with a different inflection, not dismissal. Something more like a challenge stated as entertainment, the way a skilled opponent announces a move in a game they expect to enjoy. He landed on the cliff top in a controlled drop, one for all absorbing the impact through his legs, and turned to watch her circle back up to her thermal with 4 immense wing beats that he felt as much as heard. She went up fast, using the air with absolute authority, and resumed her position above him, but closer now. Tighter circle. More present. He sat down on the cliff's edge with his legs over the drop and watched her. Sora, he said, because the name had been there since the first moment he'd seen her up against the sky. Sora, sky in his language, the one word that matched the fact of her completely. She tilted in her circle, and the angle of it was expressive in a way he couldn't quite translate but understood the emotional register of. It was theatrical. Pleased. The posture of something that had just been given exactly the quality of attention it felt it deserved. He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. He spent most of the morning on the cliffs, learning the colony's geography the way he'd learned the valleys, by watching, by moving through it slowly, by being present without agenda. The smaller pteranodons were curious in the skittish way of things that weren't sure yet whether curiosity was safe. They came close and then retreated, approached from angles they thought were oblique enough to be unnoticed, made calls to each other that had the quality of debated opinions. Sora watched all of it from above. He found a broad flat ledge about 20 meters below the cliff top, accessible by a scramble down the face that was not technically difficult but required comfort with the drop, and he sat there and watched the ocean. The view from the ledge was extraordinary. The coastline curved away north and south, all black volcanic rock and white water, and directly east the water was deep blue trending to green at the shallows, and in the distance there was the suggestion of other land, another island, but far enough away to be theoretical. He was eating, more of the valley fruit, supplemented now by a protein source he'd worked out from the jungle's edge, smoked over the previous night's fire, when the sound from below changed. He went still. The colony's ambient sound shifted in a very specific way. Not the alarm he'd learned to recognize, that was sharp and cascading, one voice triggering the next in a spreading wave. This was different. A focused, collective attention that pulled all the individual threads of the colony's chatter into a single-pointed silence, broken only by a low, continuous call from somewhere below the ledge level, where the cliff face had a deep recessed alcove he hadn't examined yet. He leaned out and looked down. 3 things were happening simultaneously below him. 1. Vasa's people were on the rocks at the cliff base, having come along the shoreline from the south on 2 small inflatable craft that were drawn up on the only accessible beach section, maybe 400 meters from where the cliff proper began. 2. They had equipment deployed, not the sensor arrays he'd seen in the valley, something different, larger, with directional components pointed upward at the cliff face. 3. The alcove below him was occupied, and whatever was in it was making that low continuous sound and not coming out. He was already moving before his brain had finished the inventory, dropping down the cliff face with one for all, managing the holds, moving fast but not reckless, reading the rock and using it. 30 meters down to the alcove level, across the face to the recessed section, into the shadow of the alcove in about 40 seconds of focused climbing. The alcove was larger than it looked from above. Deep enough to swallow the direct light, floored with generations of nesting material, dried sea grass and stripped branches and the molted crest fragments of juveniles from many seasons. In the back, pressed against the stone with her wings folded tight and her head down in the instinctive posture of something trying to make itself absent through pure intention, was a pteranodon. Not small. Not a juvenile. A full adult female, large enough to fill the alcove with her presence, and the reason she was making that low continuous call and pressing herself against the back wall was the device pointed at her from outside. The equipment on the rocks below was projecting something, an audio frequency or a signal, that was clearly interfering with her orientation, her ability to navigate, possibly her ability to fly. A grounding device. Something designed to neutralize the mobility of exactly these animals. She looked up when he entered the alcove and her expression was the most direct thing he'd encountered on this island yet, pure, uncomplicated fear, and underneath it the desperate animal focus of something that was trying to find a way through a situation it didn't understand. He crossed the alcove slowly, crouching as he moved so he wasn't filling her exit, and looked at the equipment below through the alcove mouth. The device was a projector array, 4 units arranged in a rough square on the rocks, all pointed upward. 2 of Vasa's personnel were with it, monitoring, and 2 more were at the cliff base with containment equipment. Not sonic like the enclosure for Crest. Something more sophisticated. He could see from here that it was causing active distress. The alcove pteranodon wasn't the only one affected, because the colony above had gone into a reduced activity state, the ones on the outer ledges sitting heavy and grounded, movement slow and uncertain. He looked at the pteranodon beside him. "I'm going to fix this," he said. "Stay here for 1 more minute." She watched him with those frightened eyes and he held her gaze long enough to mean it, not reassurance as noise, but as something concrete. An actual promise from someone who had the actual ability to keep it. Then he turned and climbed down the cliff face toward the rocks below. He came off the cliff face at the base and landed on the rocks with a sound that brought all 4 of Vasa's personnel around in an instant, weapons up, professional and fast. He ignored the weapons. He walked directly to the projector array and crouched in front of the nearest unit, examining it for 3 seconds to understand the power configuration, then pulled the unit's power coupling cleanly out of its housing. The continuous projection sound cut off. He pulled the second unit's coupling. Third. Fourth. Above him, the colony sound shifted immediately, a cascading release of tension moving through the ledges, calls resuming, wings moving. In the alcove, he could see the pteranodon shake herself and extend her neck, regaining the orientation that the device had been stealing. He stood up and turned to the 4 personnel. "These don't come back out on this coastline," he said. The 2 at the containment equipment were looking at each other. The 2 by the monitoring station were looking at him with the specific expression he was getting familiar with, professional reassessment. He'd seen that expression on the perimeter guard in the valley. He was seeing it more often now, and he understood what it meant. It meant the briefing they'd received hadn't included him. "We have authorization from Dr. Voss to, the cliffs are mine," Izuku said. Not aggressively. The same way you tell someone the parking space was taken. Simple fact, offered without ceremony. A longer pause. "We should call this in," one of the monitoring personnel said quietly. "Do that," Izuku said. "Tell her the Northern Territory is closed to asset recovery operations. Tell her I said so." He picked up 2 of the projector units, walked to the water's edge, and dropped them in the ocean. He went back for the other 2 and dropped them in as well. Then he climbed back up the cliff face, and didn't look back, and none of them fired. He was back on the cliff top, watching the colony resume its natural patterns in the afternoon light, when Sora came down. Not a gliding past this time. A landing. She came off the thermal in a long controlled descent and hit the cliff top with her feet, a double impact that made the rock shudder, and folded her wings in a series of deliberate movements that had something ceremonial about them. She stood maybe 8 meters from him and looked at him directly, and this time the curiosity in her eyes had company. Something warmer. Something that looked, across the species barrier and the language barrier and all the other barriers that should have made this moment impossible, remarkably like gratitude. He looked back. "The cliffs are your territory," he said. "All of it. Nobody comes up here without your agreement." She made the sound, the low, complex one that wasn't in her standard vocabulary, the one he'd heard her use only to the animals that tried to approach her altitude. Except now it was turned directly at him, and stripped of the dismissal element, what was left was something he was going to think about for a long time. Then she walked toward him, not fast, not hesitant, just direct, and stopped with about 2 meters between them, and looked down at him from the height advantage that her standing position and sheer size gave her, and made a quieter version of the same sound. He held up one hand, slowly, and she lowered her head until the long beak was within reach of his palm, and the moment her crest was close enough, she pressed the side of it against his hand with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental about it. He felt the warmth of her through his palm. The realness of her. The enormous and specific realness of this creature who ruled this sky and had just chosen, with full consciousness of what she was choosing, to be in contact with him. "Sora," he said again, quietly. She made a sound. Short, high, carrying. The same one as before, but this time he understood the inflection. Yes. That's me. He came back down from the northern cliffs late in the afternoon with the wind at his back and Sora's shadow moving across the terrain ahead of him. She'd launched off the cliffs and was tracking his path south, high enough to be surveying rather than following, low enough for him to see her without squinting. He was halfway back to the plateau when the calm's traffic started. He didn't hear it directly. What he heard was Vela, who met him at the valley's northern edge with Sift and Crest in tight formation, a configuration she only used when the information she had was urgent enough to warrant the visual emphasis. She clicked at him in a rapid sequence he was still parsing, but the broad strokes were readable enough. Activity. East. The old maintenance network. Show me, he said. She turned and ran, and he followed, one for all in his legs, moving through the valley at a pace that covered ground fast enough to be meaningful. Crest was still carrying a slight hitch in his stride from the sonic device. 3 days hadn't fully resolved it, but he kept up without acknowledgement of the limitation, and Izuku didn't mention it because Crest's feelings about the whole incident were still architecturally load-bearing and he wasn't going to touch them. Vela led him to the eastern ridge, the boundary between the valley and the rougher country that led toward the old park infrastructure, and stopped at the crest, dropping low. He dropped beside her and looked. Below, in what had been a maintenance access corridor, a wide cleared track that the jungle was actively reclaiming but hadn't yet won, a column of vehicles was moving north. Not 2 or 4. 8. The largest ones were heavy-duty cargo carriers, covered, their suspension compressed under weight. Flanked by the smaller tactical vehicles he'd seen before, with armed personnel riding the outer platforms. A logistical operation. Not a reconnaissance mission, not a targeted asset recovery. This was infrastructure movement. Someone was relocating equipment, a lot of it, to a new position north of the valley, which put it between the valley and the northern cliffs. Between his territory and Sora's. Vela looked at him with those gold eyes carrying the flat, comprehensive assessment of someone who had already reached the conclusion and was waiting for him to catch up. Yeah, he said. She clicked once. He watched the column move. The cargo carriers, he wanted to know what was in them. The sensor arrays were one thing, the grounding projectors were another, but this scale of movement suggested something qualitatively different. Something that required heavy equipment and significant personnel and the kind of logistical coordination that you didn't spin up for a wildlife management operation. He looked at the sky. Sora was still up there, visible against the afternoon blue, and she'd altered her course to circle the column from altitude. She'd seen it. She made a sound from up there, the same low complex call, but louder, carrying, and it had a third element now that he hadn't heard from her before. Sharp at the end. An edge to it. Anger. The specific, precise anger of something watching people move through its world with the assumption that they owned it. Not yet, Izuku said, to her and to Vela and to himself. We need to know what they brought before we decide anything. Vela made a sound that was adjacent to agreement but not identical to it. She was logging her own timeline for not yet and he understood it had limits. He watched the column until it rounded the northern ridge and disappeared from sight, then stood and turned east. There was a secondary access point to the old maintenance infrastructure network from the east face of the park ruins. He'd spotted it on his first day's scouting and catalogued it without following up. Now he needed to follow up. Not tonight. Tonight he needed to think. He went back to the plateau, and the fire, and the stars, and sat at the cliff's edge with the valley dark below him and the northern lights of Vasa's operation visible now, far off, just a faint smear of artificial light against the natural darkness of the island, small enough to seem insignificant. He knew better. Sora landed on the plateau behind him without warning. The impact of her feet on the rock was loud and certain, and she folded her wings and walked to the cliff's edge and stood beside him and looked at the distant lights with the same attention he was giving them. Vela was on his other side. Theria was somewhere below in the dark valley. He could hear her, that bass note presence, moving along the western tree line at her unhurried pace. He thought about the woman with the tablet, assembling her incomplete picture in some forward operating station to the north. He thought about the column of heavy vehicles and what they were carrying. He thought about the grounding projectors and the sonic enclosure and the sensor arrays, all different tools serving the same fundamental purpose: control. The reduction of something wild and alive and complex into an asset that could be managed. He thought about every person who'd ever told him what he couldn't be. They think this island is recoverable, he said to the dark. They think if they bring enough equipment they can put it back the way it was. Sora made a sound beside him. They're not wrong that it's recoverable, he said. They're wrong about who recovers it. Vela clicked once. Soft, precise. The valley breathed below them, vast and patient, doing what it had always done, living, regardless of who thought they had opinions about it. He fed the fire higher, and the light of it went out into the dark in every direction, visible from the valley, visible from the northern ridge, visible from anywhere on this island that had eyes to see it. He wasn't hiding. He'd never been hiding. And whatever Voss had brought north in those cargo carriers, she was going to find out very soon that the island's new order wasn't interested in negotiations about terms. Only about what came next. Chapter 4, The Broken Queen. He found the facility by following the screaming. Not animal screaming this time, the silence. The specific, wrong silence of a section of jungle that should have had ambient life and didn't, the way a room goes quiet when something has frightened everything in it into stillness and the fear is still fresh enough to keep them there. He'd been moving east through the park ruins for 2 hours, working the secondary access route he'd identified from the plateau, when the jungle simply stopped talking. No insects. No birds. No rustling undergrowth. The wind moved through the canopy overhead and made its usual sound, but below the canopy was absolute quiet, and the quiet had a quality to it that was less like peace and more like a held breath. Vela had stopped 6 meters ahead of him, 1 foot raised, head forward, every line of her body pointed at whatever was in the east. He came up beside her and looked. The facility was built into the hillside, not constructed on top of the landscape but integrated into it, which told him this predated the park's public-facing infrastructure. Older. Pre-tourist. The kind of structure that got built when you needed to do work that you didn't want guests walking past. The hill had been excavated and rebuilt around a central bunker design, the concrete face of it barely visible through 20 years of aggressive vegetation, and what remained exposed was dark and utilitarian and serious in the way that only things built to contain something dangerous were serious. 2 entry points he could see, a vehicle access ramp descending into the hillside, heavy blast doors standing open at the bottom, and a personnel entry at grade level with a keypad lock and a camera above it that was, he noted, currently active. The camera's indicator light was on and moving in a slow automated sweep. Active facility. Active power. Somebody was maintaining this place. But the vehicle ramp's blast doors were open, and there were tire tracks in the mud at the base of the ramp that were fresh, maybe 24 hours old, and the tracks were deep, which meant the vehicles had been loaded when they left. Which meant those cargo carriers from last night hadn't brought something to this facility. They'd taken something from it. He looked at the open blast doors and the darkness beyond them. Something still inside, he said. Vela made the sound he'd started calling her yes but careful sound, affirmation wrapped in warning, the click equivalent of agreeing while simultaneously grabbing someone's arm. I hear you, he said. He went anyway. The vehicle ramp led down at a 15-degree grade for about 40 meters before leveling into a wide internal corridor lit by emergency lighting, red-tinged, low intensity, the kind that told you the main power was either offline or being conserved. The air down here was different from the jungle above, cooler, filtered, carrying the particular institutional smell of concrete and machine oil and something biological that had been enclosed for a long time. He moved along the corridor's edge, one for all bleeding into his muscles in that quiet steady way, his footsteps minimal. Vela was behind him. He'd expected her to stay topside and she'd looked at him with an expression that communicated her feelings about that idea with complete efficiency, so she was behind him, moving with the soundless precision that made her presence in an enclosed space more asset than liability. The corridor branched left toward what sounded like mechanical systems, ventilation, generators. Right toward something else. He could hear it faintly from the right branch, a sound that wasn't mechanical. A sound that was irregular, arrhythmic, alive. Low and intermittent and carrying enough information even at this distance to tell him that whatever was making it was in pain. Not acute pain, not screaming, not thrashing. The kind of pain that had gone on long enough to become background noise, and the creature making it had learned to exist alongside it the way you learn to exist alongside a chronic wound. He went right. 2 more branching corridors. Security doors, all standing open, all recently used, the lock mechanisms dark and disengaged. The power to the locks had been cut, which meant either the facility had been deliberately decommissioned or the power rerouting had been careless. The cargo carriers took the power coupling when they went, he thought. Cleared out fast and didn't bother leaving things tidy. He passed a lab space through a porthole window, the interior was gutted, equipment removed, leaving only the fixed infrastructure, benches, drainage channels, lighting rigs now dark. Whatever research had happened here was packed and gone. The last door before the corridor's end was different from the others. It was thicker. The frame was reinforced with additional steel plating that had been welded on as a modification, an afterthought to the original design, added when whoever used this space realized the original spec wasn't sufficient. The door itself was ajar, pushed open from the inside, and the damage to the frame where the latch had been was extensive and recent. Claw marks. 3 parallel grooves through the reinforced steel, each one the depth of a finger. The force required to make marks like that in steel was not a thing Izuku was going to spend time calculating, because the answer was going to be enormous and the more relevant data point was that the door was already open. He stepped through. The chamber beyond was the largest interior space in the facility, maybe 20 meters across, the ceiling 4 meters up, the lighting here still partially functional, 1 panel of 6 still on, the others dark, throwing the far corners into shadow. The floor was metal grating over a drainage system and the drainage channels were stained dark. Old stains, not fresh. The kind that clean surfaces didn't have. In the center of the chamber, attached to the grating by 4 anchor points on a radial arrangement, the chains thick, heavy, institutional, was a shape that it took his brain a full second to properly assemble, because it kept trying to categorize it as 2 separate things and it was one. She was roughly 2/3 the size of a standard velociraptor at the shoulder, but the proportions were wrong for any species he recognized, the skull too long, the forelimbs too powerful, the coloration not any single thing but a shifting pattern of deep charcoal and pale silver that moved through the scales depending on angle, like oil on dark water. The tail was longer than the body, scaled differently along its length, the tip heavier. The claws were extraordinary, engineered, he thought, not evolved, or maybe evolved from an engineered template, precision where nature would have been approximate. She was facing away from him. The anchor points kept her in a restricted range of movement centered on that spot. She knew he was there, the head had moved when he entered, a minimal rotation, no more than 5 degrees, enough to put him in peripheral vision without turning to face him. She made the sound he'd heard from the corridor. Up close it wasn't pain exactly. It was subtler than that, and more complicated. It was the sound of something that had been expecting a particular kind of ending and was now recalibrating, trying to decide what category this new arrival belonged to and whether the recalibration was worth the energy. He walked toward her slowly. The chains were slack enough that she had maybe 3 meters of movement in any direction from her center point, and he approached along a line that kept him at the edge of that radius, close enough to be present, far enough to leave the choice to her. She turned. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and the intelligence in her eyes was the most complex thing he'd encountered on this island. Not the deep stillness of Theorius intelligence or the bright tactical sharpness of Vela's, something that had the characteristics of both and also something neither of them had. Something human in a way that made his chest ache, because it had the specific quality of intelligence that knew it was in a cage, had always known it was in a cage, and had spent its entire existence navigating the profound and unanswerable question of what it was. Hybrid. He could see it now, the Velociraptor Foundation, clearly, but modified and built upon and adjusted in ways that were visible as careful intention. Somebody had made her. Somebody had decided what she should be and had constructed her toward that specification, and she had exceeded the specification in every direction, and they hadn't known what to do with that, so they'd put her in here. The chains were thick enough to hold a car. He crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level, and looked at her without flinching from any of it, the intelligence, the damage, the extraordinary unsettling quality of her presence that he suspected had been specifically engineered to unsettle. She lowered her head and looked at him from a centimeter lower, matching his adjustment exactly. He said, "You broke the door." She made a sound. It wasn't one of the sounds he'd learned from Vela. It was its own thing, specific and unreplicable, carrying a register that he felt in his back teeth. "They left you," he said. It wasn't a question. The chains rattled slightly. Not from movement, from the tension of her entire body changing quality at those words. A whole body acknowledgement that she wasn't going to make with her face. "I'm going to take the chains off," he said. "After I do that, you can do whatever you want. If you want to leave, leave. If you want to kill me, you can try." Vela made a sharp sound from the doorway. A very short, very definitive objection. "I'm not negotiating with her," Izuku said, without looking back. "She's been negotiated at her whole life. I'm telling her the truth." He stood up and looked at the anchor points. 4 of them, bolted through the grating into the concrete subfloor. The chains themselves were heavy gauge, industrial, with locking mechanisms at the collar end. The collars were around her legs, 2 front, 2 rear. He examined the locking mechanism on the nearest front leg. Keyed lock, no key present. The mechanism was designed to be tamper-resistant. He was not a tamper. He was something categorically different. He took the nearest chain in both hands, let one for all run fully through his arms and hands, and pulled. The anchor bolt came out of the concrete subfloor with a sound like a gunshot, the grating buckling upward around the extraction point, and he dropped the chain and moved to the second front anchor before the echo had finished. Second chain. Third. He was at the 4th when she moved. She didn't attack him. She moved away, a fast lateral step that took her to the edge of the room, putting the maximum available distance between herself and the anchor points, and she stood there with the free chains dragging from her leg collars and looked at the room like she was seeing it differently now that it wasn't holding her. He pulled the 4th chain. The collar mechanisms were still locked, he'd need to deal with those separately. He looked at the nearest one and considered the hardware. The lock was the weak point. He pressed his thumb against the lock body, focused one for all to a very precise point, the way he'd learned to do over years of fighting opponents that required surgical rather than comprehensive force, and pushed. The lock body cracked and the mechanism released. He did the same for each of the other 3. She let him approach each time. She didn't assist him and she didn't retreat. She stood and allowed it with the particular quality of dignity that comes from something that has decided, carefully and deliberately, not to respond to something the way it would naturally respond. When the last collar fell away she shook herself, that full body shake that he'd seen Vela do, the reset motion, and looked at him. He stepped back and opened his hands. "Yours." She looked at the door. She looked at him. She looked at the door again, and he could see her working through something that was bigger than the immediate situation, a calculation not just about him but about what this moment meant in the context of everything that had led to this moment. Every prior decision that had been made about her, by her, around her. Whether this was another variable in the same system or something different. "Nix," he said. She looked at him sharply. The name had landed, he could see it. He didn't know why it was right, only that it was, the same way all the names had been right. Something about the shifting quality of her coloration, the dark light pattern that moved through her scales like something that lived in the space between one thing and another. She made a sound. It was the first sound she directed at him rather than past him, and it was short and complex and he couldn't translate it but he didn't need to. He'd heard that register before, in a different context, from a different kind of creature. From people who'd learned to be suspicious of kindness because the kindness had always come with a cost, and were arriving, slowly and against their own better judgment, at the possibility that this time the math might be different. He turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, after a pause of maybe 4 seconds, he heard her follow. Vela's reaction to Nyx was the most expressive thing Izuku had seen from her. She was blocking the doorway when Nyx and Izuku reached it, and every line of her body was communicating something dense and urgent. Her posture wasn't aggressive, she wasn't displaying threat, but it was absolutely certain, the posture of someone who had information she needed to convey right now and was not going to move until it had been conveyed. Nyx stopped. They looked at each other, the two of them, and a conversation happened in the space between them that moved too fast and too quietly for Izuku to follow. He didn't try. He stood to the side of the doorway and let it happen. Whatever passed between them, it wasn't simple. Vela clicked 3 times in a pattern he hadn't heard before. Nyx responded, a single low sound, different from anything in Vela's register, carrying something that Izuku could only describe as a question. Vela answered. Nyx's head tilted. Vela clicked again, and this time it was shorter and flatter and had the quality of a statement of fact rather than an argument. Then Nyx looked at Izuku. He looked back and said nothing, because this wasn't his conversation. Nyx moved forward. Vela stepped aside, not all the way, not immediately, but enough. They came level with each other in the doorway and held there for a moment that had the particular weight of significant things, and then Nyx passed through and kept moving, up the corridor and toward the ramp, toward the light. Vela fell in beside Izuku, and her click this time was different from any of its previous versions, it had a quality he recognized as provisional. Okay. For now. I'm watching. Good, he said. Keep watching. Nyx stopped at the top of the ramp. She stood at the threshold between the artificial darkness of the facility and the open daylight of the jungle, and she was absolutely still, not with the stillness of predator patience, but with something rawer than that. She was standing in sunlight for what might have been a very long time since the last time she stood in sunlight, and she was taking it the way you take something that you'd stopped believing was real. He didn't rush her. He stood at the ramp's edge and watched the jungle and gave her the time. After a while she stepped forward into the light and looked up through the canopy at the sky, and her coloration did something he hadn't seen yet. The charcoal scales went almost translucent at the surface in the direct light, and the silver patterns brightened, and she went from being dark to being something that caught the light and threw it back changed, and she was, objectively, one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen. Then she put her nose to the ground and started tracking something southwest. Not escaping. Tracking. Moving with the focused efficiency of something that had a specific purpose and the capacity to pursue it. He watched her go, the long tail disappearing into the undergrowth, and felt Vela come up beside him. She'll come back, he said. Vela made the rolling chest sound, agreement with a qualifier. Maybe. Possibly. I'll believe it when I see it. But there was something else in it this time. Something underneath the qualifier that was softer than everything else in her usual vocabulary. Something that sounded, if you were listening for it, a great deal like hope offered at arm's length by something that had been disappointed before and was trying to be careful this time. He turned east, toward where the vehicle tracks led out of the facility access road, and followed them. He wanted to know where those cargo carriers had gone. He wanted to know what they'd taken from this facility when they pulled out. The research equipment. The specimens, maybe, he'd seen evidence of multiple containment chambers in the facility's layout, all empty. Whatever Voss had been doing here, she'd been doing it for a while, and she'd moved operations north in a hurry. The tracks led him to a junction where the old maintenance road met a wider access route running north-south. North was where the column had been heading last night. He followed for 20 minutes, moving carefully, and found the first edge of Voss's northern installation when he smelled the generators. He stopped and assessed from a tree-lean vantage point. The installation was larger than he'd expected. Not the portable, deployable operation of the Valley sensor networks, this was fixed infrastructure. Pre-existing structures from the park's original operational phase had been reoccupied and expanded, 3 main buildings arranged around a central courtyard, vehicle parking for at least a dozen units, antenna arrays on 2 of the roofs, perimeter lighting on automatic timers. A serious facility, resourced for extended operation. And people. Enough people that it had the ambient sound of an occupied space, voices, equipment, movement. He estimated 20 to 30 personnel at minimum. Maybe more inside the structures. This wasn't wildlife management. This was a base of operations. He was studying the layout and mapping entry points when the movement to his left registered, too smooth, too fast, too knowing about this particular terrain. He didn't reach for one for all. He turned his head. Nyx. She was in the tree lean beside him, close enough that he could see the silver patterns shifting in her scales as her breathing moved them. She was looking at the installation with an expression that he'd never seen on any of the others, focused and cold and absolutely without the animal neutrality that wild creatures brought to threat assessment. This was personal. There was history between her and those buildings, and it was written in the tension of her entire body and the way her claws flexed against the ground in a slow, controlled rhythm. He looked at the installation, then at her. She'd tracked southwest from the facility, he'd assumed without destination. But she'd come directly here. She knew exactly where this was and what it was. "What did they do to you in there?" he asked. She didn't answer. Of course she didn't answer. But she turned and looked at him, and the intelligence in her eyes was doing something he recognized. It was the look of someone deciding whether to trust a person with information that had cost them a great deal to learn. He held her gaze and waited. She turned back to the installation, and after a moment she moved, not forward, not attacking. She moved laterally along the tree lean until she reached a specific vantage point, then stopped and looked back at him. "Come and see." He followed. From this angle, the installation's eastern building was visible in a way it hadn't been from his first position, and what he saw on its eastern face stopped him. The building had external cabling running along its wall in a configuration he recognized, the same projector array mounting hardware as the grounding units from the coastal cliffs, but scaled up significantly. Larger power draw. More units. The mounts were empty right now, but the infrastructure was there, and it was designed for deployment, not permanent installation. A mobile version of whatever they'd pointed at Sora's colony. But bigger. He looked at Nyx. She was watching his face with that precise intelligence, watching him assemble the picture. "They were testing it," he said. "The coastal units were tests. This is the actual system." Her claws flexed against the soil. "What does it do at full power?" he asked, knowing she couldn't tell him in any language he'd parse, but the act of asking helping him think. "Just grounding." Or, he stopped. Looked at the installation again. At the scale of the power infrastructure. At the antenna arrays on the roof, which he'd initially categorized as communications and was now reclassifying. Not communications. Not primarily. Signal projection. Wide area. The kind of system that didn't target one colony or one animal but could blanket a geographic area. "It's area suppression," he said. "Wide area. The whole island." Nyx made a sound from deep in her chest, low and certain, the sound of confirmation given by someone who has been waiting a long time for someone else to understand something. He stood there for a moment with that knowledge settling into him and rearranging everything around it. Not sensor arrays and targeted asset recovery. Not even the grounding projectors, bad as those were. A system designed to suppress the entire island's animal population simultaneously, grounding the flyers, disorienting the herds, incapacitating the predators, leaving the whole ecosystem vulnerable and controllable in a single operational window. Voss wasn't trying to recover individual animals. She was trying to recover the island. All of it. At once. He thought about Sora, riding her thermal above the cliffs. About Theoria in her cycad grove, enormous and ancient and indifferent to everything that didn't move through her world with honesty. About Vela's organized, intelligent pack. About Crest with the hitch in his stride and his pride that refused to acknowledge it. He thought about Nyx, standing in the sunlight at the top of that ramp like she was rediscovering the concept of the sky. He thought about Rexa, who he'd seen twice now and hadn't truly met yet, who had looked at him from the ridgeline and walked away and had been walking parallel to his awareness ever since, a presence at the edge of everything, waiting for something. No, he said. Not loud. Not to Nyx in particular, or to the installation, or to the island. Just the word, placed cleanly in the air, a statement of the most fundamental kind. Nyx looked at him. I need to understand their timeline, he said. How close is this to operational? He looked at the mounting hardware again. Empty. The units were elsewhere, moved, possibly, to the cargo carriers. Getting deployed somewhere. But the power infrastructure here was live, which meant the deployment was designed to feed back to this installation for the activation signal. You didn't carry that kind of power capacity in the field. You built a fixed transmission point and you projected from it. The empty mounts weren't empty because the system wasn't ready. They were empty because the projector units were already in their field positions. Already placed. And when Voss triggered the activation from this installation, the system would go live simultaneously across the island. He needed to find the units before she activated the system, or he needed to destroy the installation before it could transmit. Or both. He turned from the tree line and started walking back south, moving fast, and Nyx came with him, not following, walking beside him, matching his pace with the long easy stride of something built for exactly this kind of sustained ground speed. He looked at her sideways as they walked. She looked back. The silver in her scales caught the afternoon light and moved through it, and her eyes carried that layered intelligence, and she was watching him think the way Vela did, tracking his process, building her own parallel model, arriving at conclusions he hadn't reached yet and waiting for him to catch up. You know this installation better than anyone, he said. Her head tilted slightly. You know where they put the field units. Not a tilt this time. Something more still. More certain. Can you show me? She held his gaze for 3 full strides of walking, and then she looked forward and accelerated, not to full speed, not leaving him behind, but moving to the front of their shared trajectory and angling slightly west, with the deliberateness of someone who knows the route and is prepared to lead it. He lengthened his stride and followed. Vela was waiting at the plateau base with Sift and Crest, and the moment she saw Nyx she went through the whole range of her professional assessment again, faster this time, arriving at a different conclusion than the one she'd reached at the facility doorway. The conclusion she arrived at now was visible in the way she adjusted her position. She stopped centering herself in the path and moved slightly left, creating space. An opening. Nyx walked into the space and stopped there. Not claiming it. Testing whether it was real. Vela clicked once. Short and flat. It's real. Nyx made a sound that was all her own, and Izuku didn't know what it meant, but Vela's response was immediate. She looked forward, adjusted her stance, and the pack's formation shifted to a new configuration with 5 positions instead of 3, the spacing and angles recalculating to account for the additional presence. Not tamed. Not commanded. Choosing. He looked at his pack, Vela, Sift, Crest, and Nyx, the 4 of them arranged around his position as naturally as a sentence arranges around its meaning, and felt the weight of what he'd built here settle into his bones alongside one for all, heavy and warm and real. He looked east, in the direction of Voss's installation, and thought about timelines. About what it meant that the projector units were already deployed. About the urgency implied by the rushed evacuation of the facility and the column of cargo carriers moving north. She was close to ready. The pieces were in place. She was waiting for something, a confirmation, a final calibration, a window. He needed to move faster than her window. He looked up at the sky. No sign of Sora, but she was up there, she was always up there. Somewhere south of the valley, in her cycad grove, Theria was doing what she always did, which was exactly what she chose to do. And somewhere on the eastern ridges, moving along the high ground in the particular way he'd now catalogued as her pattern, Rexa was completing her circuit of the territory she'd watched over for decades. He'd been putting off that meeting. Not from fear. He didn't have fear for this anymore. Fear had been replaced a long time ago by something more useful and less corrosive. He'd been putting it off because some things needed to happen in their own time, and he'd felt, every time Rexa had entered his awareness and then moved on, that she was the kind of thing that would announce its own readiness. He thought about the activation window Voss was building toward. Some things couldn't wait for their own time. Some things needed to be accelerated. Tomorrow, he said. We go to Rexa. Vela made a sound. Nyx made her own sound, different, complementary, the same decision reached from a different direction. He fed the fire and sat with his pack in the dark, and the island breathed all around them, enormous and patient, and somewhere on the eastern ridges the old queen moved through her territories under the stars with the absolute authority of something that had outlasted everything the world had thrown at this place. In the morning he was going to walk up to her and finish the conversation that had started on the first day. He was ready. Chapter 5, The Battle for the Valley. He found Rexa at dawn. She was exactly where he'd learned to expect her, the eastern ridge, the high ground where the volcanic rock broke through the soil in long clean shelves that caught the first light before anything else on the island did. She was standing at the ridge's highest point with her back to the valley, facing the ocean, and the morning light hit her from the side and threw her shadow long and dark across the rock below her. He came up the ridge alone. He'd told Vela before first light, and Vela had responded with everything in her arsenal, the full body posture, the rapid click sequence, the gold eyes carrying their most comprehensive argument. He'd listened to all of it with the attention it deserved and then told her again, alone. She'd looked at him for a long time and then looked at Nyx, who was watching the exchange with that layered intelligence, and something had passed between them that he didn't try to intercept. When he left the plateau camp, only his own footsteps followed him up the ridge. The ascent took 40 minutes. The rock was stable and readable, and he moved steadily, not hurrying, letting the climb be what it was. The island was loud in the early morning, the full chorus of it, birds and insects and the distant hadrosaur calls carrying up from the valley, the wind off the ocean building as the sun came up. By the time he crested the final shelf and came level with the ridge top, the light was full and horizontal, and the ocean beyond the cliff edge was deep blue going gold where the sun touched it. Rexa heard him at the shelf's edge. He knew she heard him because she stopped being completely still, a single adjustment, the massive head swinging slightly, orientation updating. She didn't turn. She stayed facing the ocean. He walked toward her. The closer he got, the more the scale of her became physical rather than visual, not just something he could see but something he could feel, the particular weight of a presence so large it changed the air pressure around it. Up close, the scars were vivid. The long one from shoulder to skull. The jaw marks. The older, deeper damage along the right flank that told a story about a fight with something that had come very close to winning. She'd been carrying those stories for decades, and she wore them the way old warriors wore theirs, not as loss, as record. He stopped 10 meters behind her and to the left. The ocean moved below the cliffs. The wind moved through the ridge grass. Between those two sounds was a silence that felt inhabited, full, the silence of two things deciding together. He didn't speak. He didn't perform. He stood on the ridge in the morning light and let one for all breathe through him at its natural frequency, not a weapon, not a display, just the full honest fact of what he was, offered without apology to whatever assessment she was making. She turned. Not fast. Nothing she did was fast unless it needed to be. She turned with the deliberateness of something that had all the time it needed because the world would wait. She turned until she was facing him fully, and she looked at him with those eyes, dinner plate wide, amber dark, and the intelligence in them was different from anything he'd encountered yet. Not tactical, not analytical, not the processing of a predator calibrating a threat. It was the intelligence of age. The specific, irreplaceable quality of something that had watched enough cycles of the world to recognize patterns across decades, and was currently engaged in the act of placing him inside a pattern. He looked back. She lowered her head, not quickly, the same deliberate arc as always, until when I was level with his face, maybe 6 meters away, and she looked at him from there with a patience that had geological ambitions. He said, "I know you've been watching." The eye didn't move. "I know you've been deciding." Still nothing. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because something is coming for this island and you've lived on it longer than anything else that's currently breathing, and I think you know that too." A long, long silence. Then she made a sound. He felt it before he heard it, a subsonic component that moved through the rock under his feet and up through his legs and into his chest where it resonated like something finding a matching frequency. The audible layer of it came a half-second later, a sound so low and full it was less heard than experienced, and it went out from her across the ridge and down into the valley and across the water, and it was the sound of the island itself having an opinion, filtered through the oldest throat on the island. Izuku felt every hair on his body stand up. Not from fear. From recognition. The way you feel recognition when something you've understood abstractly becomes suddenly, viscerally real. He took 4 steps forward, closing the distance to 2 meters, and he looked up at her face from there and said, "Rexa." She held absolutely still. "I've got the valley. I've got the cliffs. I've got the jungle and the plateau and the western range. But this ridge is yours, and everything east of it is yours, and I'm not here to change that. I'm here because on our own, we have pieces. Together, we have the island." The eye moved, a slow traverse, taking him in from feet to face, comprehensive and final. The last look of something completing an assessment it had been running since the first morning on the ridgeline. She straightened up. Full height. The shadow she threw across the rock in the morning light was enormous, reaching past him and down the western face of the ridge toward the valley. She held that height for a moment and then she stepped forward, past him, one massive foot placed precisely on either side of his position as she moved by, close enough that the air displacement from her movement pressed against him, and she walked to the ridge's western edge and looked down at the valley. He turned and stood beside her. Below, the valley was alive in the morning, the herd moving, the mist burning off the low places, the cycad grove green and dense where Theria's territory centered it. Far south, just at the edge of vision, the ruins of the old park infrastructure. And north, just barely visible through the morning haze, the angular rooflines of Vasa's installation. She looked at the installation for a long time. He looked at it with her. "Yeah," he said. "That's the one." They came back down from the ridge together, and the valley watched them come. He'd never felt the island's attention as a single unified thing before, it had always been distributed, multiple points of awareness converging on him from different directions. But walking off the ridge with Rexa behind him, her footsteps shaking the ground in a rhythm that everything in the valley could feel, the island's attention gathered into something coherent and complete. Everything that lived here knew what this meant. Everything that had been watching and deciding and waiting arrived simultaneously at its conclusion. Vela met them at the valley floor. She looked at Rexa. Then at Izuku. Then at Rexa again, and her expression went through several things quickly, ending somewhere between professional satisfaction and something more personal that she covered efficiently. Nyx was beside her, and Nyx's reaction to Rexa was different, a complete stillness, the kind that came from genuine awe rather than assessment, the particular response of something encountering a scale it had known existed but not encountered directly. She held that stillness for 3 seconds and then collected herself with visible effort, which told Izuku more about Nyx's self-awareness than anything he'd seen from her yet. Crest and Sift appeared from the eastern undergrowth and both went immediately into the most alert posture he'd seen from either of them, tails high, weight forward, not threat display but the instinctive response to proximity with something that occupied the absolute top of every hierarchy they'd ever known. Rexa ignored all of it with the serenity of something that had long since stopped requiring acknowledgement. Theria came out of the cycad grove. She walked to the valley center at her own pace, which was unhurried in the way that natural disasters were unhurried, and she stopped 30 meters from Rexa, and they looked at each other in the particular way of two things that had shared a territory for a very long time and had a relationship too old and complex to be described by simple categories. Whatever passed between them took about 10 seconds. Then Theoria looked at Izuku, and the expression in her deep-water eyes was the closest thing to approval he'd ever seen from her. Above, cutting in from the north on a long fast glide, Sora arrived. She'd been watching from altitude, she was always watching from altitude, and she came down now in a controlled descent that ended with her landing on a section of raised rock at the valley's edge, folding her wings with the theatrical precision she brought to everything, and surveying the assembled gathering with the amber eyes that missed nothing. She made a sound. The complex, low one. Izuku looked at his people, Rexa, Theoria, Sora, Vela, Nyx, Crest, Sift, and felt the weight of it properly for the first time. Not as a collection of individual relationships, each built separately, each its own negotiation. As a whole thing. An entity with its own coherence and gravity. He was about to say something when Nyx clicked sharply. Once. Then twice. Then a rapid sequence that brought Vela's head around in an instant and snapped every animal in the valley into alert. He didn't need a translation. He could hear it himself, the sound had been building beneath his awareness for the last 30 seconds while he'd been distracted by the moment, and now that he was listening it was unmistakable. Drones. Multiple. Coming from the north. They came over the northern ridge in a formation that was obviously military in design, not the consumer drones he'd expected but something purpose-built, low-profile, matte black, flying in a staggered spread that maximized coverage without clustering targets. 12 of them that he could count in the first pass, and behind them, coming around the ridge's eastern end, the vehicle column. Larger than the one from 2 nights ago. More vehicles, more personnel, and riding the lead vehicle's external platform with the easy confidence of someone who had done this many times before, a figure he hadn't seen yet but recognized immediately from posture and bearing. Commander Harkin. The drones spread across the valley in their operational pattern and Izuku was already moving, one for all going fully live through his entire body, not the quiet background hum but the real thing, green crackling at his knuckles and his eyes and the air around him carrying the particular charge of several hundred generations of power doing what it was built to do. Vela, he said. The western approach. Keep the vehicles from flanking. She was already gone. Sora. He looked up. She was looking down, waiting. The drones. She launched off the rock with a single wing beat that sent a shockwave of displaced air across the valley floor, and she went up like something fired from a cannon, and the drones that had been flying in formation encountered a 9-meter wingspan moving at speed and began to scatter. Izuku looked at Rexa. She was already facing north, already reading the column's approach line. He didn't need to say anything to her. She understood vectors. She'd been reading vectors on this ridge for longer than the park had existed. She moved. The ground shook. Seriously shook, not the polite trembling of her regular footsteps but the full commitment of 12 tons of animal at purposeful speed, and the sound of her coming was a language that the vehicle column's forward personnel clearly understood, because the lead vehicles began to brake and reorient and people were shouting. Harkin didn't shout. He watched Rexa coming and said something into his comms, quiet and precise, and the column's formation adjusted in response with the rapid efficiency of a unit that had pre-planned multiple contingencies. They knew she was here. They'd planned for her. What they hadn't planned for was how fast she was, and what they definitely hadn't planned for was the Therizinosaurus emerging from the cycad grove on their western flank at the same moment. Theoria didn't run. She didn't need to. She walked, and the deliberateness of her walk in this direction at this moment carried all the force of intention that running would have carried in anything smaller. Izuku crossed the valley at full sprint, one for all throwing him across the grass at a speed that reduced the 200-meter gap between himself and the column's lead element to a 6-second problem. He hit the space in front of the lead vehicle, not the vehicle itself, the space in front of it, landing in a crouch that cracked the hard-packed earth under his feet and straightened up with the green light still running through him. The lead vehicle stopped. Harken stepped off the platform. He was a large man, not the largest Izuku had faced, but large in the way of someone built for sustained operational activity rather than single-event force. His gear was better than his personnel's, tailored and deliberate. His face was closed and professional, and he moved with the economy of someone who had trained the waste out of every motion. He stopped 10 meters from Izuku and looked at him with the flat, complete attention of a specialist assessing an unknown variable. "You're the one who pulled our sensor arrays," he said. "And the grounding projectors," Izuku said. "And the enclosure." Harken nodded slowly. "Not conceding, cataloging. Dr. Voss wants to speak with you. Dr. Voss can come here." "She'd prefer, I know what she'd prefer," Izuku said. "She's been preferring it since the first sensor alert. She prefers information, controlled environments, and conversations that happen on her terms." "I understand that. But we're in the valley, and the valley is mine, so the terms are mine today." Harken looked past Izuku to where Rexa had stopped her approach, still far enough back to give the scene room, close enough that her presence was physically felt by every person in the column. He looked at Theria on the western flank. He looked at the sky, where 3 drones were down and Sora was banking on a 4th. He looked at Izuku. "You've been here less than a week," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of someone revising an estimate significantly upward. "The island was already here," Izuku said. "I just introduced myself properly." A pause. Something moved in Harken's expression, not softening, adjusting. The recalibration he'd seen before, faster this time because the information set was now comprehensive. "The projector array," Harken said. "You know about it. Wide area suppression. Island-wide coverage from the northern installation. The field units are already deployed." Izuku watched Harken's face confirm each element. "I need to know the activation timeline." Harken was silent. "Not asking for your loyalty," Izuku said. "I'm asking for your professional judgment. You're a soldier. You've been to places where the plan went wrong because the people writing it didn't understand the terrain." He gestured at the valley, at Rexa, at Theria, at the sky where Sora was visible as a wide dark shape against the blue. "Look at the terrain." Harken looked. He looked for a long time. He looked at Rexa with the specific attention of a professional encountering something that genuinely impressed him, which Izuku suspected didn't happen very often. He looked at Theria with something that might have been, briefly, awe. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at Izuku and said, 72 hours. Maybe less. She's waiting on a calibration window. Atmospheric conditions affect the projection range. When the window opens, she activates. Izuku felt that land. 72 hours. 3 days to find every field unit and neutralize it, or destroy the installation's transmission capability before the window opened. "How many field units?" he asked. 14. Positioned in a ring around the island at pre-surveyed coordinates. Harken paused. "I don't have the coordinates." "Does she?" "Only her and her lead tech." Above them, Sora had taken down a 5th drone and the remaining ones were pulling back north, recalled. Harken or someone in the column had made the call to pull them, recognizing the engagement was unwinnable. Izuku heard Vela's pack on the western edge, the specific click pattern of containment. The vehicles over there had stopped, surrounded without a single shot fired. "Pull your people back," Izuku said to Harken. "North of the valley. Today." Harken looked at the ground for a moment. Then at Izuku. "And if I don't?" One for all went through Izuku's fist in a single compressed pulse, not at Harken, into the earth between them. The impact sent a shockwave through the valley floor that the vehicles felt as a chassis vibration and the personnel felt in their knees, and it left a depression in the earth a meter across and half a meter deep, clean and sudden. He looked at Harken without heat. "Just clarity." "Then I pull your people back," he said. "And I'm less careful about it." Harken looked at the depression. At Izuku. At the valley. He touched his comms. All units, this is Harken. We're pulling back to the northern installation. Bring the drones. A pause. Yes, the functional ones. He looked at Izuku one more time, and the expression was something Izuku hadn't expected, direct, honest, the look of one professional to another across a line that had been clearly drawn. She's not going to stop, Harken said quietly. Pulling back doesn't change her timeline. It just clears the field. I know, Izuku said. That's why I asked for the timeline, not a ceasefire. Harken almost smiled. Just almost. Then he turned and walked back to the column, and the vehicles began their reversal north, and the valley exhaled. Nyx found the first field unit. She'd been ranging the island's edges since morning. He understood now that she'd been doing this every day since he'd freed her, building her map, reconstructing the installation's deployment pattern from whatever she'd observed during her time in the facility. She led him to the first unit 2 hours after the column withdrew, moving through the southern jungle with that long silent stride, and showed him the unit without ceremony, a projector assembly bolted to a concrete anchor post at the jungle's edge, camouflaged with applied vegetation, its indicator light showing a slow pulse that meant standby, waiting for the activation signal. He looked at it for a few seconds to understand the hardware, then pulled the power coupling and disconnected the signal receiver. The slow pulse died. How many do you know? He asked. She moved north. Led him to a second unit inside an hour. Then a third. She knew 6 of the 14 positions, which meant 8 were still dark to them, likely in the northern and eastern zones that she hadn't been able to range yet. He looked at the dead third unit and thought about remaining time. 68 hours, approximately. 8 units still active. 8 unknowns. Sora, he said, to the sky. She appeared 20 minutes later, dropping from altitude in response to whatever signal his presence put into the air, and landing on the high ground above their position with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting to be useful. He looked up at her. I need eyes on the northern and eastern perimeter. Anything that looks like the units we've been finding, fixed posts, camouflaged, with equipment mounted. She made the low complex sound. Show me when you find them, he said. Don't engage. Find and show. She launched, and the wing beat sent the grass flat for 10 meters in every direction, and she was gone into the sky in the way she was always gone into the sky, immediately and totally, as if the air had simply decided to include her. He looked at Nyx. You did good. She made her sound, the short, specific one that was entirely hers, the one he still couldn't fully parse but understood the emotional frequency of. He was starting to think it was the sound of someone who had spent their entire existence being told what they were and was encountering, incrementally and with appropriate skepticism, the experience of being told something different. Worth something. Vela found him at the plateau camp at nightfall with blood on her forelimb that wasn't hers. He looked at it and then at her, and she made a click sequence that he parsed as, contact, eastern edge, personnel, resolved. Not dead, she'd have a different register for that. Routed. How many? 3 clicks. 3 personnel, a small team that had tried to push into the valley from the east while the main force was pulling back north, a secondary probe designed to test whether the withdrawal had left gaps. It hadn't. Vela had covered the eastern approach as a matter of standard procedure and had met the probe with the same professional efficiency she brought to everything. Are they gone? A single flat click. Obviously. He cleaned her forelimb with water from the camp supply and she allowed it with the precise tolerance of something that had decided physical care was acceptable but wasn't going to pretend to enjoy it. Crest and Sift were at the camp perimeter in their usual positions, and the quality of their alertness was heightened. Not fear, the elevated readiness of animals that had been tested and had answered the test and were prepared to be tested again. Rexa was on the eastern ridge. He couldn't see her but he could feel her, that bass note presence that had become part of his landscape over the past days. She'd moved to the ridge after the confrontation and she'd been there since, watching the northern territory, the old queen doing what she'd always done, watching her territory from the high ground with the patience of something that knew time moved in her favor. Somewhere south, Theria was in her grove. The valley sounds were normal and full and alive. He sat at the fire and looked north, where Vasa's installation threw its faint smear of artificial light against the dark sky. 60 hours. He had 8 field units still active, Sora searching the perimeters, the installation itself still functional. He needed all 14 units before the activation window, or he needed to reach the installation's transmission hardware. Both, probably. Belt and suspenders. He was working through the logistics when footsteps came up the plateau path from the south, human footsteps, one person, not trying to be quiet. His attention sharpened but didn't spike. The quality of the movement said singular, not advance element. A person who was approaching a camp they could see and making themselves audible on purpose. He didn't stand up. A figure came out of the dark at the plateau's edge and stopped at the firelight's boundary, looking in. A woman. The dark hair pulled back. The scientist's posture. The tablet still in one hand, not raised like a shield but held like a tool, like it was simply where her hands usually were. Voss. She looked at him across the fire and said, "May I sit down?" "You walked 2 kilometers through active predator territory at night," he said. "Alone?" "Yes. To ask if you could sit down. I find that starting with a reasonable request establishes a better baseline than arriving with demands." She looked at Vela, who was sitting to Izuku's right with the focused attention of something that had made no decisions yet but was fully prepared to make several. "She's extraordinary." "She knows," Izuku said. "Sit down." Voss sat on the far side of the fire, set the tablet on her knee, and looked at him with the comprehensive assessment she'd been building since the first sensor alert. Up close, she was exactly what he'd catalogued from a distance, precise, intelligent, the kind of composed that wasn't performed but structural, built into her operating system over years of work that required it. "You know about the array," she said. 14 field units. Northern installation transmission. 72-hour activation window. He looked at her. 60, now. She received that without visible reaction, which told him Harkin had reported the conversation accurately and she'd already accounted for his knowledge in her planning. "I built half the animals on this island," she said. "Did you know that? The hybridization program, the genetic augmentation, the behavioral modification protocols, that was my work. 10 years of it." She looked at the fire. "I know every animal here better than anyone alive." "You know what you built," Izuku said. "That's different from knowing what they became." She looked up sharply. Not defensively, the look of someone who'd heard something that cut closer than they'd expected. "The array," Izuku said. "What happens to the animals when it activates at full power?" A pause. "Temporary," she said. "The suppression effect is, what happens?" She held his gaze. "Neurological disruption. Orientation loss, motor impairment, behavioral dysregulation. 48 to 72 hours of effect before recovery. And in that window, we move the population to managed sectors. Controllable environments. It's not," she stopped. Looked at the fire. "It's not permanent." "It doesn't need to be permanent," Izuku said. "Rexa has been managing this ridge for 30 years. 48 hours of neurological disruption is, do you understand what that is? Do you understand what it costs something like her to lose orientation for 48 hours? Voss was quiet. "Nix," he said. She looked up. "You left her in the facility. Chained. When you pulled out. The composure held but it cost something." He could see the cost. The relocation schedule was compromised. "We had to, you left her." Silence. "She found me," Izuku said. "She led me to your field units. She's been outside for 3 days and she's more functional and more herself than anything your facility produced. He looked at Voss directly. Your management framework isn't protecting these animals. It's preventing them from being what they are. Voss looked at her tablet. She looked at the fire. She looked at the dark valley below the plateau. The board wants viable assets, she said quietly. If I can't demonstrate controlled management capability, they'll authorize more aggressive recovery methods. Military grade. No preservation mandate. She stopped. Started again. The array was supposed to be the compromise. Temporary suppression, managed relocation, enough control to satisfy the board without permanent damage. Who authorized the facility, he asked. What they did to Nyx in there. A longer silence. Nobody specifically authorized it, she said. That was Rail's initiative. He believed the hybrid needed accelerated behavioral conditioning to be safe for managed environments. She met his eyes. I should have stopped it. He let that sit. You've got a board pushing for military recovery, he said. A commander who takes initiatives you don't sanction. And a system that, even if it works exactly as designed, treats everything on this island like inventory. She didn't answer. Shut it down, he said. The array. The field units. The installation. Shut it down and take your people off this island. And the board sends someone who doesn't have a preservation mandate, she said. Someone who doesn't care what the array does to them. Someone who just wants the assets secured and isn't interested in recovery timelines. That's your problem, Izuku said. That's the problem you need to solve. Not by controlling this island, by controlling your board. She looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to trust that you can maintain this ecosystem without management infrastructure, she said. You've been here a week. The ecosystem maintained itself for 20 years without you, he said. I'm not replacing your infrastructure. I'm what the island decided to do instead of your infrastructure. Voss looked at the valley. At Vela, who was watching her with those gold eyes. At the dark ridgeline where Rex's presence was a constant, felt frequency. She opened her tablet and typed something. Then she turned the screen toward him. 14 coordinates, laid out in a ring across the island's geography. All the field units. Harkin won't like this, she said. Harkin will manage, Izuku said. She stood up, tucked the tablet under her arm, and looked at him across the fire. I built things on this island that I can't predict anymore, she said. That should frighten me. Does it? A pause. Something moved behind the composure, something honest, something that had been there the whole time underneath the precision and the structural calm. Something that looked, unexpectedly and briefly, like relief. No, she said. That's what frightens me about it. She turned and walked back into the dark, her footsteps careful and unhurried on the plateau path, and the night closed around her. Vela looked at Izuku. I know, he said. She clicked, the rolling chest sound, the agreement with qualifier. I know, he said again. We verify every coordinate before we trust them. He picked up the tablet she'd left, she'd set it on the rock beside the fire, deliberately, as she stood, and walked away from it. He looked at the 14 coordinates and started building the route in his head. 36 field units to find and disable in the next 56 hours, and a transmission installation to reach before Voss's window, regardless of whether she just offered a genuine compromise or the most sophisticated information operation he'd faced yet. He looked at Vela. At Nyx, who had appeared at the plateau's edge during the conversation and was sitting in the shadow beyond the firelight with those oil and silver scales catching the glow. He looked at the sky, where Sora was invisible but present. He looked east at the ridge. Early start, he said. Vela was already on her feet. Chapter 6, The Last Alpha. He moved before sunrise. The coordinates from Voss's tablet gave him the ring pattern clearly, 14 positions spaced at roughly equal intervals around the island's perimeter, designed to create overlapping coverage fields that would blanket everything within. Smart deployment. Whoever had planned the placement understood the terrain. He'd confirmed 6 positions with Nyx the previous day, and the tablet's coordinates matched them exactly, which told him the remaining 8 were accurate and told him something else too, that Voss had made her decision before she climbed that plateau path, before she sat across his fire, maybe before she sent the column south. The walk had been confirmation, not negotiation. He didn't trust it completely. He verified anyway. Sora had marked 3 northern positions from altitude during the night. She'd come down to the plateau in the dark hours and landed beside the fire without announcement, and the way she'd oriented herself toward the coordinates he'd spoken aloud told him she'd been mapping the same ring from above, building her own picture. When he showed her the tablet, she'd looked at it with those amber eyes for a long moment and then looked at the sky and made the low complex sound that had become, over 5 days of working with her, as readable to him as plain speech. I know where they are. He split the work 3 ways. Nyx took the southern arc, the 6 positions she already knew plus the 2 adjacent ones that fell within her ranging territory. She left before first light without ceremony, disappearing into the jungle with that long silent stride and the silver in her scales catching the last of the stars. Sora took the northern perimeter from the air, the positions that required covering ground fast and from above, she could locate, assess, and if the units were accessible from altitude, physically disable them. He'd seen what her beak could do to a drone's airframe. A projector unit's power coupling wasn't meaningfully different. He took the eastern arc with Vela and the pack, moving fast through the terrain he knew best. One for all in his legs, the coordinates memorized, Vela threading the route with her instinct for this island's bones. The first unit was exactly where the tablet said it would be. He pulled the coupling in 4 seconds and they kept moving. The second was the same. By the time the sun was fully up, he'd cleared 3 eastern positions and Vela had clicked a report from SIFT. Nyx had taken down 4 in the south, the signal going dark on the pack's awareness in the specific way they'd learned to feel the suppression network's individual nodes. He was keeping count the way he kept count in a fight, not with anxiety, with the clean focused arithmetic of someone who knows the problem has a finite number of moves. The 4th eastern unit was different. It was guarded. 2 personnel, armed, stationed at the access point with the alert posture of people who'd received specific orders about this position. He saw them from 100 meters out through the undergrowth and stopped, Vela stopping with him, reading the same information from a slightly different angle. He looked at the unit behind them, the slow standby pulse visible even from here. He looked at the 2 guards. He walked out of the undergrowth and toward them at a normal pace, and they had their weapons up before he'd closed half the distance, calling the stop order in the professional tone of people who meant it. He didn't stop. I'm going to disconnect that unit, he said, still walking. You can move or I'll move you. Either way takes about the same amount of my time. The nearer guard tracked him with the weapon and said, "This is your final warning." "It really isn't," Izuku said. One for all went through his legs in a single explosive burst and he covered the remaining 50 meters in a time that the guard's nervous systems weren't designed to process, arriving between them before either had completed the reactive trigger pull, and he took the nearest weapon by the barrel and directed it into the soil and looked at the second guard from a distance of about 1 meter. The second guard made the professional decision. He pulled the coupling, dropped it, and kept moving. Behind him he heard one of the guards into his comms, "He's at grid 7, proceeding north," and filed it away. Harkin was tracking him. Expected. He'd been tracking everything since the column withdrew, building his updated picture with the same professional thoroughness he brought to all his work. The 5th Eastern Unit was unguarded. The 6th had been recently vacated, boot prints in the soft earth around the post, fresh, and the coupling was already removed, which meant someone had gotten there first and he didn't know who until Vela clicked the specific pattern that meant pack, friendly, and he understood. One of Vela's network, she had contacts across this island that he was only beginning to map, alliances built over years of the pack's territorial ranging, and she'd been running her own parallel operation this whole time with a comprehensiveness that made him feel briefly and pleasantly outmatched. He looked at her. She met his eyes with the gold coin steadiness and made the rolling chest sound. "You had this," he said. She clicked. "Obviously." The count reached 12 by mid-morning. He felt the network dying as each unit went dark, not literally, but in the quality of the island's ambient awareness, the way pressure drops before a storm that then doesn't come. The suppression system's ring had been designed to function at full complement. Each unit that went offline degraded the whole network's coverage, and at 12 of 14 the system was too compromised to perform its intended function even if the transmission fired. He still needed the installation. Because Voss's window wasn't just about the 14 field units. The installation itself carried a failsafe. He'd understood this from the moment she described the board's position. If the transmission system remained intact, the board could authorize a replacement deployment, new units in new positions, a new window, and this whole campaign would be a delay rather than a resolution. He needed to reach the installation's transmission hardware and take it apart in a way that wasn't easily rebuilt. Vela's pack could hold the valley. Rexa held the eastern ridge. Theria was the western flank, impassable to any vehicle or personnel column that didn't have a way to negotiate several tons of focused, indifferent purpose. The island's defensive architecture was complete. What remained was the installation itself, and Harkin, and the question of whether Voss's overnight decision to give him the coordinates had reached her personnel as an order or whether he was walking into a fully operational forward base that was expecting him. He was north of the valley, moving up the access route, when Harkin stepped out of the tree line ahead of him. Alone. Weapon holstered. Both hands visible. Izuku stopped. They looked at each other. "She told you," Izuku said. "She told me to stand down," Harkin said. "She didn't tell me to leave." "Are those different things?" "I've served under Dr. Voss for 6 years, Harkin said. "I've run operations on 4 continents. I've done things that were necessary and things that were expedient, and I've learned to tell the difference, mostly in retrospect." He looked at the installation, visible now through the trees, the rooflines, and the antenna arrays. "What we did to the hybrid. In the facility. That was expedient. I told myself it was necessary. I was wrong." Izuku looked at him. "Nix. She wasn't an asset," Harkin said. She was something we didn't have a category for, and we put her in the category we had. That was the mistake." He met Izuku's eyes directly. "I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you I understand what happened and I understand what I owe." "What do you think you owe?" "Safe passage for my personnel off this island," Harkin said. "And the installation's transmission hardware. Delivered." Izuku was quiet for a moment. "Delivered how?" Harkin reached into his vest pocket and produced a data drive. The installation's primary transmission system is controlled through a central processing unit in the main building's lower level. This drive contains the access authorization and a system-wide protocol. 20 seconds connected to the primary terminal and the whole transmission architecture is gone. Software and the firmware that runs it. He held it out. "The physical hardware you can have for free." Izuku looked at the drive. "Why not do it yourself?" "Because she'd have me arrested for destruction of corporate property," Harkin said, and the dry precision of it was the most human thing he'd heard from the man yet. "But she can't stop you. And she knows she can't stop you. Which I think is the point she's been arriving at for several days now." Izuku took the drive. Harkin nodded, not deferential, not submissive. The nod of a professional concluding a transaction he'd decided on his own terms. He turned and walked back toward the installation, and Izuku followed him. The installation's main gate was open. Personnel were visible in the courtyard, but the quality of their activity had changed since the column's withdrawal, the purposeful operational movement of the previous days replaced by the organized, methodical work of people breaking down equipment and preparing for departure. Vehicles were being loaded. Non-essential systems were being powered down in sequence, the hum of the installation's full power draw dropping in stages. Voss had given the evacuation order. It had already been in motion when she climbed his plateau path last night, he realized. She'd made the decision, set the wheels in motion, and then come to his fire to have the conversation she'd needed to have regardless of the operational outcome. The tablet with the coordinates hadn't been a bargaining chip. It had been an apology. He walked through the gate without anyone stopping him. Personnel looked up and registered him, several recognized him, the recalibration visible in their faces, and made way with the practical efficiency of people who had been briefed and were acting accordingly. Harkin moved ahead of him, clearing the path, and led him to the main building's entrance and through it. The interior was utilitarian and functional, corridors, equipment bays, the operational infrastructure of a serious scientific field installation. Most of it was already in the process of being dismantled. He followed Harkin down a central staircase to the lower level, where the air was cooler and the ambient sound of ventilation was heavier. The primary terminal room was at the end of the lower corridor. Harkin used a keycard to open it and stepped aside. Izuku walked in. The terminal was a rack of equipment running the full length of one wall, the transmission architecture for the array system, processors and signal amplifiers and the power routing hardware that would have driven the activation signal out through the island's field unit network. It was impressive engineering, genuinely. He could appreciate the technical quality of it while being entirely clear about what it was for. He found the primary processing unit in the rack, clearly labeled. Harkin had been accurate about that, and inserted the drive. The terminal's display activated and ran the authorization sequence in about 3 seconds. Then a progress bar appeared, and the drive's white protocol began working through the system layer by layer with the efficient thoroughness of code that had been written by someone who knew exactly what they were erasing and wanted none of it to survive. 17 seconds. 20. The display went dark. Every indicator light in the rack went from operational green to a dull amber that meant standby without signal, the particular light of systems that were running but had nothing to transmit. The hum of the transmission hardware changed quality, still powered, now purposeless. He pulled the drive, pocketed it, and looked at the rack. Then he let one for all run through both arms at once and put his hands through the rack's structural frame and pulled, and the whole assembly came out of the wall in a single movement that brought sections of the mounting framework with it, and he set it on the floor and looked at the exposed wall behind it, the cabling and power routing infrastructure that had fed the system. He pulled that too. When he walked back out of the lower level he was carrying a tangle of hardware that represented the functional core of the transmission system, and he dropped it in the courtyard in a pile that made several of the personnel step back involuntarily, and he looked at it for a moment and then looked north. The sky was clear. Open. Sora was up there somewhere, riding her thermals, and the air above this island had nothing in it today except wind and the wide clean blue that belonged to everything that flew and would keep belonging to it. He turned and found Voss standing at the main building's entrance. She looked at the pile of hardware. At him. At the pile again. The board will send someone else, she said. You said that last night. It's still true. I know, he said. When they send someone, they'll find what you found. A system that doesn't need their management framework. A territory that's been established and maintained and defended by the things that actually live here. He looked at her. That's your report. Write it accurately. She was quiet for a moment. Nix, she said. Is she? She's herself, Izuku said. Which is more than your facility ever let her be. Something moved behind Voss's composure, the honest thing he'd glimpsed at the fire, closer to the surface now. I'd like to see her, she said. Before we leave. Not to assess her. Not to document. Just to see her. He looked at her. She makes that choice, he said. Not me. Voss nodded. A small nod, precise, meaning understood and fair, and possibly I expected that. He turned and walked back out through the gate, and the installation's evacuation continued behind him, the sounds of it carrying on the northern wind, vehicles, equipment, the organized departure of people who had learned something about the limits of the systems they'd built, however they chose to carry that knowledge forward. He was back in the valley by early afternoon. The sun was high and the valley was fully itself, heard moving on the western side, the cycad grove green and still, the plateau's shadow beginning its eastward creep. He stood at the valley's center and felt the whole thing around him, the island's full geography, its rhythms and territories and the particular inhabited quality of a place where everything alive had found its arrangement. Nyx appeared from the southern jungle and walked to him without preamble, her silver scales bright in the direct sunlight. She looked up at him with those layered eyes and he looked back and they stood there together for a moment that needed no particular language. "Voss wants to see you," he said. "Before they leave. She said to tell you it's your choice." Nyx was still. He didn't push it. He turned toward the plateau and left the choice exactly where he'd placed it. Behind him, after a pause long enough to mean something, he heard her turn south. Vela found him at the plateau's edge in the late afternoon, sitting with his legs over the drop and the valley below him going gold in the declining sun. She sat beside him in the easy, present way she'd had since the first day, and they were quiet together for a while, which was its own kind of conversation now. "They're gone," he said. He could tell from the installation's direction, no ambient light, no generator hum. The site had gone dark. She clicked once. He looked at the valley. At Rex's ridge to the east, where the old queen's silhouette was visible at the high point, standing in the last of the direct light the way she stood there every evening, watching the valley darken. At the northern sky where Sora was a distant shape on the evening thermals. At the western jungle where Theria's presence was felt more than heard, that deep and certain quality of a large mind at rest in its own world. He thought about home. Not with longing, exactly. With the honest attention he tried to bring to everything, looking at a thing clearly, without decoration, deciding what it actually was. Home was a city that had rebuilt itself around a system he'd helped dismantle. A world that was still working out what heroism meant when the structures it had been organized around were gone. People he loved who were capable and whole and doing that work without him. He'd thought about them every day since the green light and the cracking sky. He thought about them now, with the valley gold below him and the island breathing around him. He would try to find a way back. Of course he would, not because he was incomplete here, not because this place wasn't real or worth staying in, but because there were threads there that deserved resolution and people who deserved to know he was alive. He'd work on that. He'd think about it seriously, in the way he thought about all serious problems. But right now, in this moment, he was here. And here was something. He heard Nyx before he saw her, the soft percussion of her footsteps on the plateau path, climbing from the south, and when she came over the edge she was moving differently than he'd seen her move before. Not the contained, watchful efficiency of the facility's corridors. Not the focused ranging stride of the southern circuit. Something looser. Something that had set something down. She walked to the fire pit and sat, not in the way animals usually sat, folded and compact, but in a posture that was almost sprawling, legs extended, weight back, the particular posture of something that had expended a significant amount of energy on something internal and was taking a moment. He didn't ask about Voss. She looked at him from across the unlit fire pit and made her sound, the specific, unreplicable one that was entirely hers, and he had enough context now, enough accumulated moments, to hear what was in it. Not fine. Not resolved. Not healed. Something earlier and more honest than any of those, the sound of something at the beginning of understanding that the weight it had been carrying was not, as it had always believed, structural. Not part of the architecture of what it was. Just a weight. That could be set down. He nodded at her once, meaning I hear it, and she looked away, and Crest and Sift came up from the eastern path and took their positions, and the plateau settled into its evening arrangement. Sora landed behind him as the first stars appeared, her wing beats the familiar shockwave he'd stopped bracing against, and folded herself into stillness beside the plateau's northern edge with the theatrical deliberateness of someone who had decided this was a good spot and was now fully committed to it. Then Theoria. She came up the plateau's southern face, which should not have been possible for something her size and which she accomplished anyway with the complete indifference to physical constraints that characterized everything she did. She settled at the plateau's broad southern end, enormous and present, and looked at the valley below her with the deep-water attention of something that had always known exactly where it was. He built the fire, because that was what he did at the end of the day now, this specific ritual, this small and necessary light in the dark, and the fire went up and the light spread across the plateau and touched everyone present. He looked at them. Really looked, the way you look at things you want to remember. Rexa arrived last. He felt her on the ridge path before he heard her, and he heard her before he saw her, the ground finding its particular frequency under those footsteps, the air pressure shifting in the way it shifted when she moved through a space. She came up the eastern axis with the patience of something that had never hurried toward anything in its life and wasn't starting now, and she crested the plateau and stood at its eastern edge and looked at the fire and at him and at everyone around the fire with eyes that held the accumulated record of 30 years on this island. He stood up. He crossed the plateau to her, and stopped within arm's reach of that extraordinary face, and looked up, and she looked down, and between them was the simple clear fact of what they were to each other. Not explained, not categorized, not in need of the names that human frameworks would reach for and find inadequate. She lowered her head until she was at his level, and he raised one hand and placed it against the side of her jaw, against the scar that ran from shoulder to skull, and felt the warmth of her and the deep slow rhythm of her breathing. She made the sound, the full one, the subsonic component that moved through the ground and through him and out across the island. It went across the valley and up the ridges and out to the cliffs where it moved the ocean air and reached the northern territory and kept going, and the island received it the way the island received all the things that had always been true about it, without surprise, without ceremony, as simple fact taking its proper place in the order of things. He stood there with his hand against the oldest living presence on this island and felt one for all in his bones and the fire's warmth at his back and the full breathing reality of this place all around him. And he was, in the most complete and honest sense of the word, exactly where he was. Not stranded. Not displaced. Not waiting for something else to begin. Here. The island's alpha. The valley's center. The thing the ecosystem had rearranged itself to include. Rexa straightened up after a while and walked to the plateau's edge and stood there looking at the dark valley with the patient authority of something that intended to keep looking at it for a very long time. He went back to the fire and sat down, and Vela was beside him with her gold eyes catching the light, and Nyx was across from him with the silver moving through her scales, and Sora was a great dark shape against the stars, and Theoria was the southern horizon made animate. He'd build something here. He already was building it. Not the park's infrastructure, not Vasa's management framework, not any of the systems that human ambition had tried to impose on this place. Something older and more honest than any of that. A territory organized around what actually lived here, maintained by the full investment of everything he was, answerable to nothing except the island itself. He'd find the way back when the way back was ready. He trusted that the way he trusted his own hands, not with certainty, but with the practical confidence of someone who had solved every problem the world had given him so far and expected that record to hold. Until then. He fed the fire and the light went out across the plateau and the valley below was dark and alive and entirely itself. And the island breathed. And the Alpha breathed with it.